Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Before we begin today's meetings, I'd like to ask Teresa Impastato, Metro's Chief Safety Officer, to provide us with this morning's safety contact. Ms. Impastato.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Fire Prevention Week is observed each year during the week of October 9th in commemoration of the Great Chicago Fire, which began on October 8, 1871, and caused devastating damage. This year's campaign, Serve Up Fire Safety in the Kitchen, works to educate everyone about simple but important actions they can take to keep themselves and those around them safe in the kitchen. Unattended cooking is the leading cause of fires in the kitchen. It's important to remain focused on the food while preparing meals and keep your cooking area uncluttered to avoid incidents. Keep a fire extinguisher nearby while cooking. For more fire safety tips, visit nfpa.org. This concludes our safety contact for the day.
Thank you, Ms. Impastato. And good morning again, everyone. I'm Paul Smedberg. I'm chair of the WMATA board. And since we are meeting virtually, I'd like to ask all presenters in all committee meetings today to introduce themselves with their name and title. I'd also request that members hold any questions or comments until the end of each presentation. I'll go round robin until there are no further questions or comments. Finally, please mute while you're not speaking to cut down on background noise. With that, I'll ask Ms. Ellison, the Board Corporate Secretary, to call the roll. Ms. Ellison?
Chair Smedberg.
Present.
Alternate Director Bulger.
Present.
Vice Chair Goldman.
Present.
Director Horner.
Present.
Alternate Director Alcorn.
Present.
Alternate Director Meridian.
Present.
Director Slater.
Present.
And Director McMillan.
Present.
Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Ellison. Before we begin, just a note, Mr. Goldman is having some technical difficulties today, so you will, for those watching, you will hear his voice but may not see him on your screen. So please take that note. Our first order of business is to approve the agenda. Approval of the agenda. If there are no objections, are there any objections to the agenda as presented? If not, hearing none, the agenda is approved. Now we'll move on to the approval of the minutes. Are there any objections to the minutes as presented? Okay, hearing none, we'll consider the minutes approved as presented. Action items. Today's action item is the acceptance of the Inspector General's report. We have one item, approval of the Inspector General's fiscal year 2021 annual audit plan. Under the board's bylaws, and the executive committee has the responsibility of reviewing and accepting audits and other reports by the IG, which includes its annual audit plan. The committee has reviewed the proposed work plan and does not have any suggested changes. Before we take a vote, I'd like to ask Mr. Charrington, WMATA's Inspector General, to provide the committee with highlights of the OIG's work plan for the coming year. Mr. Inspector General.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. I'm Jeffrey Charrington, Inspector General for WMATA. This fiscal year 2021 annual audit plan sets forth the Office of Inspector General's strategy for identifying priority audit issues and managing its workload and resources. As with last year, our planned audits are organized around four focus areas: safety, reliability, and customer service, financial management, information technology, and human capital and asset management. We are currently in unprecedented times, and WMATA is facing tough decisions every day to manage through the COVID-19 pandemic. Within these focus areas, we have prioritized audits to address new risks identified as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. These audits focus on employee and customer health and well-being, financial and procurement soundness, and information security supporting a remote workforce. I'd be glad to take any questions from the board, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Charrington. All right, as I said earlier, we'll go around the table here, starting with the executive committee members. First, Mr. Goldman.
No questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Goldman. Mr. Horner. Mr. Horner, I think you're on mute. Okay, we'll come back to Mr. Horner. Mr. Bolger.
No questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bolger. Now we'll open it up to other board members. Secretary Slater.
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Meridian.
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Alcorn.
No questions for me.
Thank you. Mr. McMillan.
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Horner. Okay. Acceptance of this audit plan constitutes the board's authorization to post this audit plan on the WMATA website, provided that the Inspector General has conferred with the General Counsel and confirmed that any private or confidential information has been removed and/or redacted in accordance with applicable law and WMATA policy. In accordance with the procedure, I move that the Executive Committee accepts the Office of Inspector General's annual audit plan fiscal year 2021. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Bolger. Ms. Ellison, please call the roll.
Chair Smedberg,
Aye.
Alternate Director Bolger,
Aye.
Vice Chair Goldman,
Aye.
and Director Horner.
Aye.
Mr. Chair, the motion passes.
Thank you. Thank you. The annual audit plan has been accepted and the Inspector General has been authorized to post it online. Since we have no further business to come before the committee, we stand adjourned. The Safety and Operations Committee will begin shortly. Please stand by.
Good morning. This is Michael Goldman, Chair of the WMATA Safety and Operations Committee. I want to welcome you to today's meeting of the committee on October 8th, 2020. I want to apologize in advance. We have some internet breakdowns in my neighborhood, so you're seeing me by voice only, no icon, no picture, no photo, no moving lips, just voice. So coming to you via cell phone. So I apologize for that in advance. And from time to time, you may hear a plane overhead, but I'll try and otherwise keep the noise down. Thank you for joining us. We have today's agenda before us. If there are no objections, I'd like to move approval of the agenda as presented by committee members. Are there any objections? Hearing none. And I'll wait a second to make sure I don't hear any. But hearing none, the agenda is approved. So our other administrative matter is the approval of minutes. We also have minutes before you from our last meeting for approval. I trust that everyone has an opportunity to review the minutes from our September 24 meeting and training session regarding the agency safety plan. Unless there are any objections, we'll consider the minutes also to be approved as presented. Are there any objections? Hearing none again, we'll consider the minutes approved. Thank you. We have a full agenda before us today, beginning with the approval of Metro's agency safety plan, which will then be presented to the board for approval later this month and then submitted to the Washington Metro Rail Safety Commission for its approval. At the committee's last meeting on September 24th, all board members participated in a training session on the background, purpose, and role of the plan from our Chief Safety Officer. Today's briefing will highlight actual sections and requirements of the plan. So while we may move quickly through today's presentation, since it covers much of the same material, that is not a reflection on the board's and the agency's commitment to safety management at all levels of the organization. And as noted then, the General Manager, Chief Executive Officer has provided the board with a certification that the agency safety plan we will be voting on today meets the requirements set forth for such plans in the statute and the FTA regulations. Following that, we will have two informational updates. The first is a review of Metro's operational performance for the fiscal year 2020 up until March 15th, 2020. That's an evaluation that will cover 8.5 months. 8.5 months when before the COVID-19 pandemic severely affected Metro's operations. Finally, the Executive Vice President of Capital Program Delivery, Laura Mason, will provide the committee with another in its series of informational reports on the Silver Line Phase 2, including updates on quality previously presented to the committee and one or more new ones, and project scheduled drivers identified by the Washington Metropolitan Airports Authority, which is supervising and undertaking the construction of Silver Line Phase 2. I would finally want to note that Mr. Horner will recuse himself from discussion on this item regarding Silver Line Phase 2, so Mr. Rouse will be presenting and participating in his place as his alternate. So I'll now recognize the Chief Safety Officer, Ms. Impastato, for our first presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to return before the board to present the agency safety plan for approval. As we reviewed in our session last month, the agency safety plan documents how Metro will implement a safety management system, or SMS, which provides the foundation for an effective and robust approach to the management of safety risk. Per the Public Transportation Agency Safety Plan regulation, the accountable executive is required to sign the plan, and approval of the ASP is required from the agency's board of directors. The ASP outlines the framework of Metro's actions to systematically identify and manage safety risk through 4 critical components: safety policy, safety risk management, safety assurance, and safety promotion. As the graphic depicts, these 4 elements are intrinsically interdependent. The safety policy elements of the plan outline the establishment of safety goals and objectives and identify the accountabilities and responsibilities for safety management throughout the organization. The safety risk management elements of the plan detail the processes in place to identify, assess, and mitigate safety risk throughout the organization. The safety assurance elements of the plan detail the processes in place to monitor and measure the efficacy of Metro's safety risk management efforts. This portion of the plan details our continuous improvement initiatives. Finally, the safety promotion elements of the plan detail how Metro will communicate the agency's safety risk management activities and the resulting safety performance throughout the organization in a manner that ensures a robust employee safety reporting process, which promotes a proactive and just safety culture. After receiving board approval, Metro will submit the ASP to our State Safety Oversight Agency, the WMSC, for their consideration and approval. We will certify that the agency safety plan is in compliance with FTA requirements and will continue to implement the plan and train departmental safety risk coordinators. This concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Impastato. Let me ask you a question or two about some aspects of the plan itself, which when we were in our briefing on September 24th, the committee and the board members hadn't had an opportunity to review. So I want to just turn your attention to section 1 of the plan that's entitled Safety Management Policy, and it's on page 26 of 134 in the materials distributed to board members. And there's a statement in there that, and I'll read it to you, in conformance with FTA's National Public Transportation Safety Plan, WMATA's safety objectives are, and then the first bullet reads, and I quote, support the management of safety through the provision of appropriate and sufficient resources in order to reduce acceptable and undesirable risk to appropriate levels. So my question to both you and the general manager would be, has the board in the fiscal year 21 budget that it has approved provided the quote appropriate and sufficient resources for the general manager and you to make this commitment for the authority that you do have appropriate and sufficient resources to reduce unacceptable and undesirable risks to appropriate levels throughout the authority?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. It is my belief that the existing budget takes into account the processes that we would execute to manage risk to an acceptable level. And the general manager and I both remain committed. Should we need additional budgetary resources, we would proactively identify that and bring it to the attention of the board.
Thank you very much for that assurance. Further on, I want to turn your attention to section 1.8. In preparation for this, I had asked some of the safety officials in the Maryland Department of Transportation to just review the plan and any comments that they might have. And 1.8 reads, specifically, executives must personally ensure and be accountable that, quote, adequate resources are available to appropriately manage risk in their areas and make cogent and accountable executive level decisions regarding safety risk tolerability. Now, the statute and the regulations rest this responsibility with the accountable executive, who is the general manager. And I think the concern raised by this section is that it can be interpreted as delegating to lower level and line officials this responsibility that would be required of the accountable executive. And I just want you to comment on that and whether you have any concerns or see any concerns about that responsibility being delegated to lower level people.
Certainly, sir. Section 1.6 of the plan is clear that the ultimate responsibility and accountability for the implementation of the SMS rests with the general manager and chief executive officer. This section expressly states that this responsibility and accountability cannot be delegated. Section 1.8, the section to which you're referring, details the accountability and responsibility of 4 levels of the organization, from executive leadership to frontline employees. In this section, we note that each member of the executive leadership team at Metro has responsibilities regarding leadership and action and support of the implementation of the plan within their span of authority. This complements the accountability and responsibility established in section 1.6 and in no way attempts to delegate the responsibilities of the accountable executive downward.
I thank you very much for that clarification and that confirmation that the responsibility for carrying out the plan resides with the accountable executive, in this case, the general manager, chief executive officer. The committee first, Mr. Horner.
I have no questions. Thank you.
I'll ask Mr. Bulger from the district. Any questions?
Yeah, Mr. Goldman, just to get me up to speed a little bit since I've been in the showers, what is the action that that new agency, I can't remember all of the acronym, what the name of it, what are they supposed to do when we send it over to them?
I think you're referring to the Washington Metro Rail Safety.
Yes, thank you, Michael.
Organization. Yes,
Thanks,
Safety
Mike.
Commission. I'll have Ms. Impastato give the more precise response to that.
Certainly. My pleasure. The Washington Metro Rail Safety Commission Safety Oversight Agency is responsible for review and approval to ensure that our plan meets the requirements of both the regulation and the agency safety plan requirements as outlined in the State Safety Oversight Program standard.
So I noticed that they preliminarily approved the plan, so it's perfunctory at this point?
We received conditional approval for the contents of the plan. We are not considering making additional substantive edits to the plan at this point. Once we receive the board's approval, we will then submit it to the WMSD for their formal review and approval.
So you're not anticipating them to say the plan is not sufficient? Is that true?
That's correct, sir. We've worked with them for quite some time.
Great.
Does that complete your questions, Mr. Bolger?
Yes, thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Next would be Mr. Alcorn. I assume you're there, Walter, but since I don't have the benefit of the Zoom Hollywood Squares screen, I will assume you're there and we'll be having some questions.
I am here, but I have no questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Secretary Slater.
No questions for me. Thank you.
All right. Mr. McMillan.
No questions, Mr. Chairman. Thanks.
Mr. Meridian.
No questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Chair Smedberg.
You asked one of my questions, Michael. I have no further questions. Thank you.
All right. Let me then ask one more question that's been raised by Maryland Department of Transportation in their review and comments. And they point out that employees must work in compliance to rules and regulations, and they are accountable for their safety and for those around them. And therefore, as a WMATA employee, if you see something wrong, your duty is to speak up and not ignore it. And so the comment is that with so many contractors at WMATA, it's imperative that they know how to report hazards directly to WMATA without fear of the company's retaliation, and that they must know and understand what SMS is and their role in it in reporting hazards. So the question is, are we requiring the training of SMS for our vendors and contractors the same as for our frontline WMATA employees?
We are working through our procurement channels to include language that details the requirements of our SMS. All WMATA contractors are required to comply with the agency safety plan. We regularly communicate with them with regard to safety on the job, and they are well aware of and will continue to be made aware of the reporting channels. As far as the identification of risks and hazards, we make no differentiation between the source of the identification, whether it be a member of the general public, a contractor, or an internal employee. And we do assure that our contractors have multiple mechanisms to report safety concerns and risks that they encounter or observe, and that we follow up and regularly communicate with the contractors the resolution of the concerns that they've raised.
But is there a training requirement for our vendors and contractors on the same level as the training requirements that we require of our employees throughout the organization?
We do have training requirements, and we are enhancing the training requirements with regard to the training that Metro delivers to our contractors. Contractor roadway worker protection training programs are including elements of the agency safety plan and SMS concepts. There are certain aspects of the agency safety plan that are not applicable to contract operations, so it wouldn't be the exact same training, but the core concepts associated with proactive identification and resolution of safety risks would remain in the training for contractors.
Thank you. I think this is an important area and one that I would ask you to report back to the committee on periodically as to the level of training that we are requiring of contractors and vendors, and when that is taking place and when that is accomplished, if you will. Thank you. If there are no further questions or comments, I'd like to call for a vote on this item. I would like to move approval of acceptance by this committee of the agency's safety plan. Can I get a second from a member of the committee?
Second.
Thank you very much, whoever you are in the committee that seconded the approval.
Horner.
I'm sorry?
That was Mr. Horner.
Mr. Horner. Thank you very much, Mr. Horner. I'll ask the board corporate secretary now to take a roll call vote.
Chair Goldman,
Aye.
Vice Chair Horner,
Aye.
Alternate Director Bolger, Mr. Bolger, Mr. Alcorn.
Aye.
Jennifer, aye. Sorry, was
Great,
muted.
no problem.
Muted again. I don't know how that happened.
Mr. Chairman, the motion passes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With approval of the agency safety plan by the committee today, we will recommend it forward for action by the full board at the next board meeting at the end of the month. Thank you. So we'll now turn to the first of the two information items. And so I would ask Mr. Joe Leader, the Chief Operations Officer, to make the presentation on WMATA's FY 2020 performance review.
Good morning to all board members and Chairman Goldman. My name is Joe Leader, Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer for Washington Metro. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yes.
Very good. Through the Metro Performance Report, Washington Metro tracks and reports out on its progress, meeting its three goals of safety, service reliability, and financial responsibility. As a public agency funded by taxpayer dollars, it is important that we are transparent about the outcomes it is achieving using public funds and accountable for meeting our goals. The Metro Performance Report helps us do that. This presentation will cover the performance for FY20 before the pandemic, which ran from July 1, 2019 through mid-March of 2020. Metro is reassessing operation performance reporting for FY21, given the impact on the pandemic on operations, and we plan to report at semi-annually. Prior to the pandemic, Metro was doing well, meeting its goals of safety, quality service, and financial responsibility, and customers were noticing. Customer satisfaction was increasing and more people were riding. Metro met its targets on 3/4 of its safety and security measures and 85% of its quality service measures. Performance against target is only evaluated for the pandemic, again, for the pre-pandemic period of July 1, 2019 to March 15th of 2020. This is because Metro sets its targets based on certain assumptions for ridership and service levels, and these assumptions were disrupted by the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, ridership exceeded budget forecasts by about 4.5% and was growing relative to FY19. Prior to the pandemic, Metro met its targets for on-time performance, fleet reliability, and elevator and escalator availability. MetroBus did not have a FY20 on-time performance target for bus due to a recent change in the measured calculation. Rail on-time performance consistently surpassed its target for every month of FY20, delivering the highest performance since the launch of this measure back in FY16. How do we come up with the units of these analysis? My trip time is the percentage of passenger trips completed on time. Metro Access and bus on-time performance is the percentage of stops or time points delivered on time. Rail reliability is miles traveled before causing a delay of 4 or more minutes. Bus reliability is miles traveled before mechanical failure. And Ellis availability is the percentage of revenue hours that the units are available. In terms of availability of track and guideway restrictions, Metro missed its target, which is a quality service measure. Guideway restrictions is a measure required by the Federal Transit Administration. It looks at the percentage of track that is restricted for planned or unplanned reasons at 9 a.m. the first Wednesday of every month. Like all transit agencies, Metro sets a target for where we expect to be at the end of the financial year. For Metro, the main driver of our performance is planned work. For example, the results of July through September reflect the platform improvement project in the summer of 2019, where about 10% of our system, everything south of National, was under construction, and those tracks were out of service 24/7. Our end of the year target built in this planned work, and by March, we were performing exactly as anticipated, with an average of 4% of track restricted through the first 9 months of the year. While above the end of the year target of 3.8%, we were on a planned guide path to get there. The good news is only 0.6% of our restrictions occurred during all of FY20 were unplanned, as compared to 0.7% in FY19. The low level and condition-related restrictions is a reflection of our preventive maintenance and our capital program, which is focused on a state of good repair. During the fall, some weather-related restrictions occur due to slippery rails related to fallen leaves. And at this time, Metro plans to install heat tape at up to 4 more stations, eliminating the need for restrictions in these areas when it comes to the fall. Prior to the pandemic, Metro met its targets for safety measures related to crime, customer injuries, serious bus collisions, and pedestrian strikes. Metro Access customer injuries are a particular bright spot this year. The pre-pandemic customer injury rate of 1.75 is 18% lower than FY19, which had a rate of 2.17. The customer injury rate is primarily driven by slips, trips, and falls, and collision-related injuries. Compared to FY19, there was a 10% reduction in slip, trips, and falls, and a 45% reduction in collision-related injuries. Metro was well within its performance band for 2 additional measures, rail collisions and rail employee injury rate. Metro did not meet target on 4 safety measures, and I will provide more detail in the following slides. And again, how did we come up with these units of analysis? The crime rate is actually the number of Part 1 crimes per million passenger trips. And Part 1 crimes are assigned by the FBI. Bus collisions are the number of incidents or collisions per million miles. Rail and bus customer injuries are the number of injuries per million passenger trips. Metro Access customer injuries are the number of injuries per 100,000 passenger trips. And the employee injury is the number of injuries per 200,000 hours worked. Before the pandemic, Metro had 12 red signal overruns, 4 more than the same time in FY19. While no red signal overruns is acceptable, for context, when you look at all the train operators on a daily basis, they encounter about 118,000 mainline signals every weekday, plus additional signals in the rail yards. What do we know about the root causes of the red signal overruns? 6 red signal overruns were deemed train operator error. The other 6 incidents involved an interlocking operator, an archer supervisor, a rail traffic controller, an equipment operator, and what we call a flag person. 4 failed to follow procedures and 2 failed due to miscommunication. 10 of the red signal overruns involved trains and 2 involved roadway maintenance machines, or what we call RMMs. 4 occurred in rail yards and 8 occurred on the main line, and 5 of the signal overruns occurred in the early morning hours between 2 a.m. and 5:45 a.m. when there was no service. What actions have we taken to improve? A root cause corrective action committee was created and continues to identify underlying root causes of vehicle movement violations and recommends mitigation. We have upgraded signal heads to improve visibility, and we conduct regular signal maintenance. We have implemented software updates to the 7K series rail cars to enable a stop and proceed mode, reducing the risk of accidental overrunning a red signal. And we are designing a solution for the 6000 series rail cars, which is currently under dynamic testing. And once the dynamic testing is completed and the solution passes, the 6000 series rail cars will be outfitted with the solution. And then we will begin to design a solution for the 2000 and the 3000 series rail cars. We continue performing efficiency testing and spot checks, including 86 red signal observations in FY20. We track and identify and address repeat offenders. And in November 2019, the Rail Operations Department began implementing safety stand-downs for employees, forums with operations staff, retraining for employees involved in red signal incidents, and developed lessons learned information sheets that were developed upon the feedback from the investigations. Building from the rail operations efforts in November, Metro Rail Maintenance Department conducted a stand down in March of 2020, which focused on safety protocols, equipment procedures, and lessons learned. And all maintenance machine operators attended that stand down. And at the end of this month, we will be conducting an additional stand down throughout rail. Archer is also conducting a virtual refresher training starting this past September on preventing zero speed command violations for all Archer operations personnel. Moving with zero speed command is a root cause contributor to the signal overruns. Before the pandemic, Metro had 5 derailments, 3 more than the same time in FY19. The increased derailments were due to the increased use of high rail vehicles to support especially the platform improvement project in the summer of 2019, where 3 of the 5 derailments occurred. All 5 derailments were contractor-owned high rail vehicles. What are the root causes? High rail vehicles have a high risk of derailment due to wheel loading and non-articulating axles. In terms of wheel loading, high rail arrangements share the load between the rubber tires and the steel wheels. The load sharing is calibrated and fixed or set under ideal conditions. But high rail vehicles have an inability to compensate in special track work areas such as switches and guarded curves, which can lead to a derailment. In regards to non-articulating axles, high rail vehicles generally have long wheelbases with axles that do not articulate. This leads to high angles of attack when in a curve. The longer the vehicle, the higher the angle of attack, and the more chance the unit has to derail. This condition is inherent to the vehicle and cannot be rectified with adjustment or monitoring. So what actions are we taking to improve? Metro is exploring different equipment options to ensure a more suitable piece of equipment is available for this task or a task in the future. Metro is also improving the contractor equipment process which is more structured and stringent with stringent inspections and stricter rules on disqualifying problematic units. And Metro conducted a safety stand down again back in March of 2020 to review these recent incidents and procedures to prevent further derailments. Before the pandemic, Metro had 51 fires, one more than the same time during FY19. The increase in fires was due to an increase in non-electrical fires. Non-electrical fires are caused by debris on the track, smoking cross ties, and trash can fires on platforms or trash can fires that are located outside our stations. What are the root causes? We had 33 non-electrical events. 10 events were due to smoking or burning cross ties, and 10 were due to trash can fires. We had 14 arcing insulator events, almost all occurring on the A line north of DuPont Circle, caused by wet weather, active water leaks, and muck buildup. What actions are we taking to improve? Metro is increasing track bed and drain cleaning frequency on the red line, where we saw an uptick in track fire and smoke conditions, while we transition to a condition-based monitoring system or program. We have performed an insulator cost benefit analysis, which was completed in June of 2020, and found that the most cost-effective approach was to replace all the insulators at these 6 specific locations every 2 years. It would cost us about $300,000 a year, but by reducing the delays caused by the fires and the inconvenience to our customers, it will save us probably about $425,000. This type of a replacement program will continue until we can complete curtain grouting at these locations and remediate the active water leaks. Maintenance forces have also installed 47 thermoplastic insulators at Friendship Height stations as part of an 18 to 20 month pilot. We are currently about 6 months into the pilot, and so far so good. As part of the thermal imaging program, our maintenance away engineering is decreasing the threshold to level 0 for thermal indications for insulators. Prior to that, we were at a level 1, so that when the thermal imaging camera picked up a heat sense, if you want to call it, we had to see a fluctuation of about 45 degrees. We've lowered that now to 25. So if an insulator next to other insulators is showing 25 degree difference from the other insulators, we will dispatch a crew to replace that insulator. Rail grinding activity is now considered hot work, and implementing all hot work requirements, we believe, will assist in decreasing tie fires. The rate decreased steadily throughout FY20, but we still did not reach the annual target. Before the pandemic, the bus employee injury rate was 12 per 200,000 work hours, above the FY target of 9.4. Collisions are a big driver of these injuries. And for the majority of our collisions, Metro was deemed not at fault. What actions have we taken to improve? Bus has piloted a collision avoidance system for 6 months, with initial data showing a 25% reduction in warnings and alerts. While this pilot has been completed, bus maintenance is now in the process of working with procurement to purchase an additional 100 mobile eye shield collision avoidance systems, which we will install on additional buses. Again, pilot, if it works, then what we'll do is start to outfit the entire fleet. SAFE continues to work with bus training to identify new safety observation options to capture more specific criteria around bus berthing and servicing stops. And this is where the most of our collisions occur. Before the pandemic, we would nose into the bus stop, leaving our rear end exposed. So we were seeing a lot of rear end collisions. And then as the bus was now beginning to pull out, we were seeing a lot of collisions in the front. So we're looking to see, and we're trying to come up with ways to berth the bus differently and try and avoid some of these accidents. And with that, I have no more comments, but I'll take questions.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Mr. Leader, thank you for that presentation. As before, I'll begin with one or two questions, then I'll recognize other members of the Safety and Operations Committee, and then other board members for their questions. For my first question, I want to focus on slide 5, which deals with the, slide 6, which deals with the red light overruns, where you've indicated that we had 12 for the past year, FY20. The target was 4. Obviously, we're not doing well. But I guess my question really is, why do we have a target of 4? Why isn't the target here 0? Why do we think any level of going through a red light is acceptable? Certainly, on the surface, dealing with roads and highways, we wouldn't say to a driver that you can run through 4 red lights and we won't penalize you. It's the 5th one that we'll go after and suspend your license. Wouldn't we improve safety by setting a target here that's a target of 0 and encouraging our operators and the controllers in the ROC to take their steps and their efforts to reach that kind of a goal? No red light running for this organization?
It's a very good question, Mr. Goldman. It's one that I think when you look at all safety goals, you would like to see them all at 0. But I think when we look at performance goals, we try to set what we think are reasonable goals, but continually make them, stretch them so that we can get down to that point of being 0. But you're absolutely right. When you look at bus collisions, you look at any kind of rail accidents, you look at any kind of employee accident, our ultimate goal is to get it down to 0. And that's really what we do. But when we set our performance goals, we try to make them as realistic as possible to allow people to see that they're improving and achieving goals. It is something I think we've all thought about, in the past as professionals. But I could tell you our ultimate goal is to get all our safety goals down to 0.
Well, I would encourage you, when you come back to us next time with this issue, red signal, as you call it, the overruns, that you certainly look at setting the target as 0. People, any operator going through a red light, whether it's underground or on the surface, is violating whatever the standard is. And we shouldn't accept any level of violation in something so basic as whether you have a red or a yellow or a green signal as something that we will tolerate. But let me ask, still on the same subject, when the operator does go through the red light, what happens to him? Is he taken out of service pending an investigation, or does he just report for work the next day as if nothing happened and perform his duties in the same way as he did when he ran the red light?
Okay, what happens once they run the red signal, they're removed from service immediately. They are sent down for a blood and alcohol testing under FTA guidelines. Then an investigation is performed to find out what the cause was. That person is typically held out 3 days because of the waiting for the results of the drug and alcohol test to come back. Discipline is then, if the operator is found guilty, then discipline is put forth with our labor group, and there is progressive discipline.
And so that progressive discipline is determined by the collective bargaining agreement, or is that determined independently by your people and your line people?
It's in line with the CBA. It's in line with the CBA, but we do have guidelines that we use based on certain offenses. In fact, an individual that just ran a red signals, it was their second one, and they're on a final warning. So the next one, they're gone. And that final warning doesn't go away. They could have one 10 years from now. That's it. It's done. So it is progressive, but it does follow the CBA.
Thank you. I just want to ask you one final question dealing with an issue near and dear to me, the red line and the arcing incidents on the red line, where you pointed out that there were 14 arcing insulation events in the past year, almost all of them on the red line north of DuPont Circle, you pointed out, caused by wet weather, active leaks, and muck buildup. Now, the authority has been phenomenally successful with the grouting mitigation around medical center that I understand, and we saw it personally when we were out on the red line some months ago, that's significantly impacted the arcing incidents and the water in the tunnel. Why isn't that strategy your highest priority for reducing these arcing insulation events on the rest of the red line down from medical center to DuPont Circle?
It is a high priority, but I mean, I think we have high priorities and with various assets, in Metro, but we are putting a program together to begin grouting up on the red line.
And what is the timing in that? Because as we'll find out in a presentation later on the Finance Committee, it doesn't seem to be in the budget for the next fiscal year, FY22. Doesn't appear to be in the capital budget. What is your timing on that?
I think we're looking at the tail end of 22 or FY23.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll go around to other members of the committee. Mr. Horner.
Oh, hi. Thank you, Mr. Committee Chair, and thank you, Mr. Leader, for all your great work. I wanted to comment on the computation of the crime goal. Thank you for clarifying that the goal with respect to crime on the system is calculated on the basis of so-called Part 1 crimes. I would encourage you, for purposes of goals next year, to include Part 2 crimes. Part 1 crimes constitute a rather narrow category of crimes. According to the Uniform Criminal Statistics Handbook, Part 1 crimes include murder, manslaughter, sex offenses, robbery, aggravated assault, motor vehicle theft, which would appear not to apply here, and arson. Part 2 crimes contemplate more sort of or other quality of life crimes that are not as serious as Part 1 crimes, but affect the experience of the system by users, customers. And Part 2 crimes include, for example, vagrancy, disorderly conduct, simple assault, and vandalism. So just a suggestion to give us a better picture of the quality of experience of the system on the part of users, you might want to expand the statement of the goal to include not only Part 1 crimes, but Part 2 crimes.
Well,
that's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, thank you. I just would like to let you know at our stat meeting for our Metro Transit Police, we do track, discuss all crimes, Part 1, Part 2. So we have that information, but it's a comment well taken. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Horner. Mr. Alcorn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Leader, for the presentation. A couple of questions. So I do want to make sure for these targets, some of them are annual targets, and I just want to make sure that the time period against which we're measuring is the same, that it's apples to apples, and particularly some of these safety related targets.
Yeah, the safety-related targets and the quality performance targets are all based on the financial year.
So we're not using 3/4 of a year of activity against an annualized target, are we?
No, the reason why we normally at this time would be reporting out on a full year, but because the pandemic hit and all the targets really, you couldn't, it's not apples to apples when the pandemic hit, because ridership and service levels were so affected and we were changing them that the targets made no more, it didn't make sense anymore. So that's why we decided to report out on the 9.5 months or the 8.5 months for this year. And
no, I understand that, but did you, when you reported only 8.5 months of the year, and the data is for 8.5 months of the year, did you adjust the targets accordingly as well?
Yes, it was based on 8.5 years of last year.
8.5 months, right?
Yeah, 8.5 months. Sorry. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure. I thought that was the case, but I just wanted to make sure. I do want to say, you know, some of the targets I think might not be completely relevant to the pandemic, especially some of the safety targets. And I do have a concern that, you know, that we're not, well, I would be very interested when you come back and actually show how you're going to be doing performance measurement over 6-month periods, how you're going to address safety, because I totally understand the pandemic has changed a lot of these targets in a way that you know, you can't measure apples and oranges. But certain things like safety, I think are going to apply no matter what, you know, no matter the level of service that's being provided. So I would hope that we don't totally ditch those performance targets for things that are critically important like that, no matter how much the level of service we're providing.
Comment taken. Thank you.
And then the last thing is, Mr. Leader, this pandemic seems to last forever, but they tell me that it won't, hopefully. So once we're past, are we going to go back to the quarterly performance measurement like we've been doing for the last few years?
We probably will. I just, you know, when that's going to happen, I just don't know. And
Understood. Okay, well, I hope we do. I think this is very, very important for the board, but also for the public. So thank you, Mr. Leader.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Alcorn. Secretary Slater.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Leader. First, I just want to say thank you for a really, really thorough report. I just have kind of 2 questions, really more to the applicability of the report, kind of as a follow-up for Metro. So I'd like to understand go from here in terms of how Metro uses the report in terms of strategies and those types of things, and then really understanding how much we use this performance report to benchmark against comparable systems, those types of things. So it's more about, I'd like to hear a little bit more about how we use the report versus the performance report itself.
Okay, well, you know, we actually don't wait for the quarterly or the, you know, semi-annual report. On a monthly basis, when I first got here, I created stat meetings for all my divisions, rail stat, bus stat, and bus stat. And we're tracking on a monthly basis what you see here per the divisions. So we're taking that data as it's coming and we're looking at it. One of the things I've decided to change is we used to only have a stand down once a year. And I think that was one of the issues that, you know, we changed that when I was back up in New York. We went to like quarterly stand downs or every 6 months, because I think the quicker we get the information out to the employees where we're not doing well, you know, what types of incidents we're having, okay, and what we need to work on or concentrate on, the quicker you'll start to see the numbers go in the right direction. So that's one of the things that has come out of seeing some of the safety statistics that were in the red. We're looking to go to more frequent type stand downs that are more relevant because it's more real time for the employee. So that's one of the things we're doing, but I can tell you, we're tracking this on a regular basis, looking at where we're performing well. From a performance, when it comes to on-time performance, we'll look for that low-hanging fruit. Where are we not performing well on maybe a certain line or a certain bus route, and then we'll put supervisors out there to figure out what we're doing wrong. We'll also take from the bus collisions, and we'll work with the locals. We've had changed routes, the directions of routes. Maybe we're seeing an uptick in left-hand turn collisions. So either we'll request, could we get a green arrow, as a light there, or do we just have them make right turns and come around a different direction? So we do use this data on a regular basis to see, what needs to be done to improve performance.
Great, thank you. Just kind of one follow-up. I know one of the issues that we have on our Baltimore system is a little bit of the on-time performance during the pandemic, because we have a certain amount of traffic congestion that's kind of built into the model. I assume you're experiencing the similar issue where the on-time performance is really associated with the bus getting there early.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
Post-pandemic. I recognize most of this report is pre-pandemic, but pandemic we're dealing with a similar issue.
Actually, that's one of the things we look at. When we break out the performance, we're looking at not only AM, midday, PMs, but we're looking at we have it broken down into the evenings. And earlies, arriving early is not good for our customers, and it usually is what's pulling down performance.
Absolutely. Can't stress reliability enough, and I can't stress enough how we should be using this data on a day-by-day, week-by-week basis, developing strategies, those types of things. So thank you.
Thank you.
We'll continue with questioning from other board members. Mr. McMillan.
Nothing for me, thank you.
Mr. Meridian.
Nothing for me either. Thank you.
Chair Smedberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I think you made a good point about the target 4 and the signal overruns. So sort of, stressing that point, given the concerns that, and the incidences we've had in that area. Joe, on that particular slide, when you have root causes, could you explain the 2 that are there? Why are those root causes? A root cause to me might be, faulty tracks or miscommunication, something more specific other than it involved trains and it just so happened to be in the early morning hours. How are those root causes? I don't understand that.
Well, I guess what we were trying to give the board was an idea where the incidents were happening. Between the hours of like 2 and 5:45, if there's a transfer train, and I'm not saying this is what happened or it's fine, it could be that an operator is not expecting a red signal, and we've had incidents like that where they probably thought it was didn't follow procedures, because when you lose speed readout, the first thing you're supposed to do is call the rock. And I think we had a case last year where we had a collision on the off night where we had a yard operator working on the main line. No service was completed. He failed to notify the rock that he had a loss of speed command, and ended up colliding into the back of a train. So the root cause there is, in some cases, we're trying to understand from a human factor why some people are just not following the rules. And there could be many reasons, like the Silver Spring derailment. When I know Teresa Imposada interviewed the operator, he swore he had the proper lineup and he had the proper signal. But meanwhile, we can see from our cameras that he didn't have it. What I think the human factor could be there is that typically we don't turn trains at Silver Spring because we're going end to end now. I think he just got so used to getting into the cab and just probably, taking a point of power that he just didn't even look at the signal. So we're trying to understand the human factor, just like Mr. Goldman is. How many people drive every day and stop at stoplights, stop at stop signs, but then fail at one point to do it, and they're in an accident? So we're trying to understand some of the human factors behind what's causing. I'm not saying that's what happened at Silver Springs, that the operator, but Teresa, I know, interviewed him, and he was emphatic that he had the lineup and he had the proper signal. But meanwhile, we have all indications, including a photo that showed he didn't have it, but he still proceeded through with zero speed commands. So I think what we're trying to give you some ideas is what's happening, what type of incidents we're having. But the biggest thing is we really need to dig into the human factor and figure out why we're having these types of incidents.
Okay, thank you. And Joe, also on that slide, up top, overruns, you have operator failure to follow procedures, and then miscommunication. The miscommunication piece seems to be a recurring sort of theme and issue, not only with overruns, but in other safety-related matters. You've already mentioned the rock just a few minutes ago. So I'm wondering, did you and your team ever consider making communication a part of your performance report in some way, or highlighting it more here, or having a separate piece or a separate report or an addendum about the rock itself and communication? Something to highlight that, because again, this is a recurring theme.
Mm-hmm.
People not following procedure and this miscommunication or no communication in some cases.
Okay.
So how are we to highlight that, monitor that in a more transparent way, I guess?
Okay, I'll take it back to the team, and we'll figure out what we could do and how and what mechanisms we can set up to not wait for an incident, but find out where miscommunication does. I know we do audits in the rock when we're looking for 100% repeat backs between the rock and our employees in the field. So we do perform that check. But there's other things that we probably need to look into. But I'll take it back to the team and see what we can come up with.
Yeah, and I guess in general, I just thought when I saw that is communication in general highlighted enough in some way, given the seriousness of it and how it seems to continuing to be a problem,
Mm-hmm.
sort of across the board. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you, Joe. Before we let you go, maybe I could ask you to explain why I didn't see in your presentation on-time performance either targets or information on Metrorail and Metrobus on-time performance for this period, the 9.5 months period. Could you just explain why that is not part of the presentation in your report?
Well, our main KPI is my trip time. That's our customer on-time performance. That's when a customer taps in and taps out, and that is on slide 5.
Right, but in prior years we've had actual targets, as I recall, for on-time performance for Metrorail and Metrobus before the app came along. Have you now eliminated those targets because you're relying on the My Trip Time?
No, we still track that target, but we typically, I think, in the last, what we've been providing the board has been these KPIs here.
All right, so might I suggest that next time maybe you would provide us some information on on-time performance target
Okay.
and actual performance of Metro Rail, Metro Bus. Just a final point, since we now have roughly 6 months of experience under COVID conditions, the last quarter of 2020 and the first quarter of 2021, would it be possible for you to come back now and in the next month or two and give us a report on what performance and targets look like under 6 months of COVID operational experience? I'm sure it's affected some of them. I assume on-time performance theoretically should be a lot better. Accidents and collisions should be reduced. But I think we would all benefit from seeing that kind of information on what performance looks like after 6 months of COVID.
No, we are. That's what the team is working on right now. What type of KPIs should we have moving forward as we're still in the pandemic? My plan is to report to the EMT as well as to the GM, let them see what we've come up with, and if it's approved, then we will be coming back to the board to let you know what the KPIs will be while we're still in the pandemic period.
Right. Well, maybe that's something you can target to do before the end of the year to see what our experience has been like under the pandemic with these KPIs.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. All right. So that completes the first informational item, the FY 2020 Metro performance. Our second informational item is the Silver Line Phase 2 update. Before we begin that update, as I noted earlier, Mr. Horner has recused himself from the discussion, so Mr. Routes will be participating in his place as his alternate for this discussion. So I would ask the corporate secretary to let me know when Mr. Rouse is on and when we can proceed with the Silver Line Phase 2 update.
Mr. Chair, he's on now, so you may begin.
Okay. Very good. So that presentation will be made by Ms. Mason. So Ms. Mason, if you can give us the Silver Line Phase 2 update presentation for this meeting.
Absolutely. Good morning, everybody. My name is Laura Mason. I'm the Executive Vice President for Capital Delivery. And this morning we'll be giving you an update on the Silver Line Phase 2. The purpose of this briefing is for information. It is to review the current status of the identified quality issues. Many of these have been previously briefed to the board. We will also review the schedule and the critical paths identified by MWA, as well as the status and mitigations being taken. On the identified quality issues, overall, there has been significant positive progress made since the last briefing. We have established bi-weekly executive level meetings with our team at WMATA, with MWA and its contractors, which is facilitating dialogue and resolution of these issues. Since our last briefing, 3 issues have been progressed to resolved. 3 have progressed to being underway, and we have added 1 new issue on the cross-bond spacing deficiencies. The items highlighted in red are the ones that have changed since the last briefing, and those are the ones that we will address. Those are the ones that have improved, and we will address the open items. On cross-level deficiencies at our special track work, this is an issue where the long concrete ties under our switches were found to have cross-level that was out of tolerance, meaning the height between the rails was not where it was expected to be. The Airports Authority at this time has completed retamping at all locations, and the retamping efforts have allowed us have brought 24 of those 29 turnouts into compliance. We are currently reviewing a proposal from the contractor to accept the remaining 5 locations without further remediation, and we are assessing the risks of accepting them as they are. The next item is tight gauge in the switches at Dulles Yard. Tight gauge, meaning the rails are too close together, has been identified in 39 switches. With remedial work, the contractor was able to achieve gauge within our maintenance tolerances, which is slightly more achievable than our construction tolerances, which are tighter. We have decided to allow dynamic testing to proceed conditioned on verifying the gauge tolerances after the test train activity. So this issue is on hold, awaiting the completion of testing. Ballast deficiencies at Dulles Yard. This issue is that ballast was contaminated with materials of inappropriate size and consistency at various locations within the new yard. The ballast remediation work has been completed as of last week, and sampling is in progress this week. We expect to have the results by the end of the month to verify compliance with our standards. On the precast concrete wall panel cracks at the Dulles Yard buildings, the contractor has completed the sealer application at all locations. Metro OIG did include this issue in their September 2020 report, concluding that the sealer application is acceptable remediation. However, that we must consider the cost for future reapplication of the sealer as we accept this solution. On the next topic, the precast concrete panel deficiencies at the 5 at-grade stations. Metro OIG completed an inspection of the current panel conditions in August of 2020. Their reports identified 184 panels that had cracks and a total of 342 cracks. The Metro OIG provided 8 recommendations addressing the panel documentation, crack repairs, future inspections, sealer reapplication frequency, and escrow cost considerations. Metro management and staff concur with the OIG findings and recommendations. On the quality issue of the rail car hoists at Dulles Yard, installation has been completed and testing and inspection are underway. We have been able to achieve synchronization of the jacks at all hoists, and functional performance testing started in September of 2020. We do still have some concerns regarding the sustained durability and reliability of the equipment, and those are pending the completion of performance testing. Finally, the new issue that has arisen in terms of quality is the potential deficiency in the spacing of crossbonds. This is related to the design of the automatic train control system. In the schematic you see at the top of the screen, we have a schematic of track 1 and track 2 to show that the tracks have circuits. Those are separated by impedance bonds, the small squares, which should always be maintaining a signal within each of those circuits, and that is how we know whether or not a block is occupied. It's how we know where the trains are or if there is broken rail. Crossbonds are cables that connect the 2 tracks, and they allow for the balance of current between the 2 tracks, the return current of the traction power system. We have identified deviations from the design criteria and industry practices for the spacing of the crossbonds. We are concerned about the results of this spacing deficiency, in that it could result in broken rails not being detected, or potentially the risk of losing train detection. We have requested for the airport authority to direct their contractor to respond to our concerns. They have sent that letter, and we are awaiting a response from CRC, the contractor. Preliminary indications are that they will have a meeting with us hopefully by the end of this month. Shifting now to schedule and looking at the drivers to completion, the top 3 paths remain the same, though they have changed in order due to significant work completed this summer during the shutdown. The top 3 scheduled drivers, as identified by the airport's authority, is dynamic testing, SCADA testing, and the completion of the tie-in at Wheelie Reston East Station. In terms of delays to the completion of dynamic testing, this is now the critical path of the project. All parties are working together to mitigate the delays to dynamic testing, and our efforts have included increasing the utilization of our test trains, implementation of split shifts for testing, meaning we are testing on both a day and evening schedule, and increasing the rate of submission and review of the prerequisite test reports. In terms of the causes for delay, what we're seeing is an increase in corrective actions to address unacceptable test results and required regression testing. Some of these are part of what we expect during testing, which is why we hold a period to do rigorous testing prior to the acceptance of the Silver Line. The second critical path is the completion of our SCADA testing. SCADA is our supervisory control and data acquisition system. This path was initially delayed by delays from the receipt of the final design data from the Airports Authority, which impacted our ability to prepare our work to connect these points into our central control. We are working very closely with the Airport Authority to expedite this testing. The third critical path is the connection of the automatic train control software between phase 1 and phase 2 at Wheelie, Reston East. We performed a significant amount of this work during the summer shutdown, allowing the existing system to be used as a test bed, which eliminated the need for lab simulation prior to downloading the software. This was a significant schedule benefit in terms of accelerating the project. However, this work will remain near critical path since the final cutover is dependent on successful weekend outages in November and December, which are required to complete dynamic testing. This work was not able to be done this summer as it required further advancement of the dynamic testing on other parts of the extension. Those weekend outages have already been scheduled and will be held in November and December. In summary, the Airports Authority currently projects a substantial completion in February of 2021 for their Package A work. We reiterate that we have not set a target service date until all identified issues have been resolved to meet our acceptance standard. I am encouraged by the progress we have made, and I'm confident we will achieve resolution of those issues. However, the Airports Authority response to the previously discussed unresolved issues will determine the path forward and ultimately the timing for Metro acceptance or rejection of the project. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
All right, we're back on the line. I guess the tech people muted me for your presentation, so I wouldn't interrupt. But I wanted to thank you, Ms. Mason, for that presentation. As usual, your update presentation is thorough, comprehensive, and to the point. I would like to begin with a question or two on warranties, and I'd like to start with the warranties on the lift, the hoist, which is, I think, slide number 9, where the slide indicates that the general contractor has assumed the warranty. But my question here is, what exactly is the warranty? Is it parts and labor and material for a given period of time? And who is going to perform the warranty? Since, as we've learned, the original manufacturer of the lift, the hoist, is sort of no longer there. Its business was acquired by some new entity. So if you could address those two questions.
Sure. So typically the warranty would be for parts and labor, and it would be by the provider of the equipment, of the hoist equipment itself. Typically it is a 2-year warranty, though in this case we had asked for an extended warranty due to some design deviations that they had proposed. However, with that supplier or equipment manufacturer no longer in business, the general contractor, HP, has assumed warranty responsibility and will take on that work to provide both parts and labor to replace any defects. They will work with their supplier they're using to complete the project to identify which responsibilities fall to them as a sub-supplier and which will be covered by HP. So they do have a plan to provide this warranty responsibility, and we are still reviewing it in further detail.
Well, thank you. Again, on the question of warranties and looking at it just more broadly as it may apply to the precast panels on the stations, is there any warranty time period on new construction project generally, such that MWA or the contractor would be responsible for any of the concrete panel repair or replacement in the event of significant degradation during the initial, 2, 3, 4, or 5 years of the, after transfer to the authority?
We do have warranty language in the project that is general for the entirety of the project. With respect to those two issues you referenced on the panels, I believe that is something that we should reserve for discussion in executive session as that relates to our decision on whether or not to accept the remediation and the conditions under which we would accept it.
Okay, fair enough. We'll put it off until at that point. All right, we'll turn to questions from other members of the committee. Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Mason, as well, as always. Just a quick question on the cross level, and then I'll get to the ATC. Slide 4, I think you said you accepted 24 of the 29. So does that mean there's 5 switches or entire turnout assemblies, crossovers that have to be accepted?
There are 5 turnouts that have not yet been accepted.
Okay. So where do we stand? I mean, I see your last note there. How far out of tolerance are they? Do we know? Are they within the ballpark of construction and maintenance, or are there any major issues remaining with those that we would accept it without further remediation?
I will characterize it this way, that they are close enough that we are evaluating the risk of accepting them as they are, in the sense that we believe service could be run safely over them. And it is a question of whether or not we anticipate seeing increased maintenance or degradation of the assets by having them slightly out of tolerance, but we don't see them as a safety issue at the remaining locations.
Okay, and out of the resampling locations, have we had enough axle load over those locations to be satisfied
Yes.
with them?
Yes, we had our engineering team determine the appropriate loading and ran test trains over that to achieve ballast settlement before taking final measurements.
Okay. Yeah, and then we go to the ATC issue, which of course, anytime anybody hears ATC, there's certainly some fundamental concerns there, especially with the system. And obviously losing a train in a circuit or loss of broken rail protection is certainly a significant issue. I do think this is an illustration of why it's important to do testing, right? This is exactly what we've been talking about. This is why you don't want to cut your testing period short. And you especially don't want to cut short the ability to get a number of trains out there on the line at the same time when you have an electrified system like this. You have negative return going to the rail. You've got your ATC system, track circuits competing for that same conductor. So putting full load out there and seeing what happens is just as important as getting the first train over it. And so strange things happen. This is not unusual. I've seen things like this before. So I think the biggest concern at this rate is whether or not it impacts your schedule in terms of final acceptance and any rework that they have to go out there and do, particularly if they have to do any significant installations between the tracks, depending on how they constructed the crossbonds here. But other than that, I think you're handling it appropriately at this stage. And again, this is why we test, right? So don't shortchange that period, and let's keep on getting time out there and making sure everything's working the way we expect it to. We run down all the major failure modes. But to add one thing, as long as it's not a software issue, that's where I have significant concerns, because those are much harder to figure out what's going on. This, at least we have an understanding of why what's occurring is occurring, and we can actually track it down and have a solution. So if you told me it was a software issue, I'd have a completely different response, but I appreciate the active engagement with the property on this and getting this right. That's all I've got.
Thank you, Mr. Rouse. Mr. Bolger?
Mute. Mr. Chairman, I don't have any questions. I'll just add that I haven't been in a board meeting in a long time, but these issues, when we were discussing Silver Line Phase 2 over a year ago, it seems to be the same issues we talked about a year ago, except for some minor or major, one way or the other, progress. I feel like this is like deja vu for me. That's all.
Yes, it does have a feeling sometimes of the Groundhog Day movie, but we are reducing the number of issues in dispute slowly but surely. Mr. Alcorn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goldman. I actually have a question about page 118 of 134 in the board package. The funding impact statement. And I'm curious, I'm not sure what that means. And I'll just read it. It says, however, based on future assessment of Silverline Phase 2 revenue service ramp up in FY 2021, amendment to the FY 21 budget may be required. I guess my question is, do we currently have planned in the FY 2021 budget costs for ramp up, assuming that these quality issues are resolved to the authority's satisfaction? Is that currently budgeted for a July 1 start date?
So our approach has been to look at the schedule and look at the likely resolution of these issues based on our assessment of the outstanding issues, as well as the airport's authority projection of a February 2021 substantial completion. That would indicate a summer 2021 start. So yes, we are ramping up with an anticipation of a service start in July. I do want to just reiterate, though, that the actual service date will be set once we actually have resolution. But from a funding perspective, we have included the budget for FY21 to include the ramp up for a summer start.
Okay. All right, good. I just wanted to make sure. I wasn't sure what that meant, and wanted to make sure that the ramp up was included. So, all right, thanks. Keep going. I know it seems like Groundhog Day for some of the members. I'm new, so I really haven't seen this before, but thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Alcorn. I think if Mr. Letourneau doesn't recover, you won't be new, and it'll be Groundhog Day for you as well in a couple months.
Okay.
So,
thank you.
Come on board. Secretary Slater.
Great, thank you. First, thank you, Ms. Mason, for a very comprehensive presentation. I know these issues are pretty challenging, and it's important that we work through them. Just most of my questions were answered really by the line of questioning from Mr. Goldman and Mr. Alcorn, but I just want to confirm based on the last question you asked. So, there's no real service date set until we resolve all the issues, but we're working off of an estimated July service date. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Next would be Mr. McMillan.
Yes. One thing, just to clarify a point for Mr. Alcorn, the budget that's currently in place is the one that was adopted a couple months ago. We have some adjustments that are in the public comment and analysis phase right now that we'll be considering in November. And that is consistent with the assumption of a July 1st date. So just a little nuance on that. And then Ms. Mason, just could clarify on the weekend shutdowns we have coming up November, December. I'm forgetting if we knew about those before. Is that something that was unavoidable, something that was a possibility, but we didn't know for sure until we saw the results of the previous tie-in work? If you could just sort of fill me in how new and unexpected the need for those additional shutdowns are.
They are not new or unexpected. Originally, prior to doing the summer shutdown, we were looking at many weekend shutdowns. I believe it was 14 plus. When we did the shutdown west of Ballston this summer, we were able to consolidate almost all of that work into the summer shutdown. However, the remaining activities need to be done at the end when we're close to SSCD. So that's why they have to be held out. So it was not a surprise for the team. They worked hard to get as much as they could done during the summer.
Okay, it was not a matter. It wasn't something that could be consolidated in that earlier thing. There was simply some additional work that needed to be done before that. Okay. Thank you. That's all I have.
Very good. Mr. Meridian.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just following up on Mr. McMillan's question, are we sure with some level of confidence that that number of shutdowns won't be expanded? There's a sense that that is the limit to the number that will be needed.
That is the expectation in terms of the testing that is required. However, if testing uncovers unexpected results or abnormal findings, obviously we may need to add more. But at this time, that should be sufficient for the testing that we need to do.
Can you give an example of what that abnormal finding might look like?
I can get back to you with some examples. I think what we're seeing with the cross-bond spacing is that this is why we need to do extensive testing. The abnormal findings could take a number of forms, but we obviously would not accept a project until we were fully confident in the results.
Great, thank you.
Does that complete your questions, Mr. Meridian?
Yes, it does. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Finally, Chair Smedberg, questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Mason, going back to the rail hoist again on slide 128, you state there that functional performance testing on the hoist has started. When in September did that start?
I don't have the date offhand, but I can get that to you, Mr. Smedberg.
Okay. Because below you say sustained durability and reliability of the equipment will be informed by this performance testing. So I guess we'll have that information relatively soon. And I'm wondering, are the tests being performed only on 7,000 cars, or given that they're, I think, are the heaviest rail cars we have?
They are the heaviest rail cars that we have. However, they are not that much heavier than our other cars. We do have both 7,000 series and 3,000 series cars that we are using as test trains.
Okay. And back to the warranty issue again. If appropriate, how are we protected with this? Just because someone, say, assumes a warranty, what other factors are in place or procedures are in place to protect us should there be a disagreement, or they're very slow to react to, say, a concern we have about a warranted part?
I believe I would be better able to answer that question in executive session.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Smedberg. Well, that completes our update on Silverline Phase 2 for this session, and that completes the business before the Safety and Operations Committee today. So with no further business before the committee, we stand adjourned. We're going to take a 1 or 2 minute break at this time before starting the Finance and Capital Committee meeting. I would ask all of those in the audience and online to please stand by. Good morning.
Good morning. Welcome to the Finance and Capital Committee's October 8th meeting. I'm Chairman Steve McMillan. Just a reminder to our participants, if you're not talking, please mute. And for our presenters, please introduce yourselves for the benefit of our audience. I'd note that for this meeting, Board Member Matt Letourneau will be joining and participating as the second Virginia member. He's not on at the moment, but we will note when he does arrive. Let me cover the administrative business first. I assume everyone has reviewed today's agenda. If there are no objections to the agenda, we will consider it approved as presented. I hear no objections, so the agenda is approved. We also have the minutes from our September 10th meeting and our August 20th executive session before us for approval. Are there any objections to the minutes as presented? Hearing none, we will consider them approved as presented. So we have two informational items on today's agenda. First, the staff will review the outlook for the fiscal year 2022 budget, which is expected to be significantly impacted by the ongoing pandemic. Just for the information of board members and the public, this is the starting point for budget formulation. Usually this is a straightforward technical exercise. It's not an exercise in policy, but given the unusual circumstances and the significant changes we've had to implement on the service side and dealing with reduced ridership, we are going to have a more extensive discussion of this at the beginning of the process than would normally be the case. Again, this is not a discussion of the policies we intend or want to implement for fiscal year 22. That will come later in the process, and that will include a presentation of a proposed budget by the GM later this year, public participation, and then adoption by the board in the spring. For the budget discussion, Mr. Devin Rouse will participate on behalf of the federal government in Mr. Horner's place since he is recused from that matter. The second item on our agenda is going to be an overview of the capital improvement program, including a preview of major upcoming projects planned in the years ahead and a review of projects completed in fiscal 20. So with that, I will turn the floor over to the general manager and his team to begin the discussion.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. This is Paul Wiedefeld, the GM and CEO of Metro. As you mentioned, this is the beginning of the 22 process. Last month, we were dealing with the 21 budget. As you know, we had to deal with significant changes there. So the thing that I just want to reinforce, just like the board, we do not want to cut any service. That's not what we would prefer to do, because obviously the impact it has on our customers, the impact it has on the recovery of the region, and eventually the impact it has on our employees, because if we cut service, generally that results in cutting employees. So none of those are things that we want to do, but we also have to deal with the financial realities that we all face, both at the federal level, at the state level, and the local level. And that's going to form what the 22 budget looks like. But first, we need to make an assumption on where we see ridership going through the 22 so that we can create the 22 budget. So one of the things that we need today is a sense from the board of where they want us to, what assumptions we should be making on ridership, because that will drive, in effect, the budget going forward. There'll be other issues we have to deal with in terms of what federal support we get and local support and all that, but the base is the ridership. So we will need that, we will need direction on that from the board. So with that, I will turn it over to Dennis Anasiki, our Chief Financial Officer, to walk through the initial thinking on the 22 budget. And as you mentioned, we will be coming back in the autumn, later in the autumn, with a more detailed plan at that time. Dennis, please.
I'm sorry, Dennis, before you begin, let's plan to pause after about slide 8 so that we can have a brief round from the board members on the scenarios themselves, and then move on to the discussion of the budget implication of the scenarios. I'd like to keep that first part of the discussion all about what we think is really going to happen. So if you could please proceed accordingly.
Very good. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Paul. And good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Dennis Anosike, Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer for Metro. Next slide, please, Laura. Thank you. So as we kick off Metro's financial planning process for fiscal year 2022, the process normally focuses on ridership, but as the chairman mentioned today, we will also share broad overview of revenue, expenses, and preliminary public funding scenarios, after which we will seek committee's guidance on the ridership scenario that will guide the budget development for next year. Next slide, please. So as a recap, slide 3 shows the 3 operating budget scenarios that Metro would have lived under in FY 2021 in response to the low ridership and revenue caused by the pandemic. The first column from the left is Metro's pre-COVID budget from April of 2020. The middle column shows the May 2020 revision to the budget. We used CARES Act funds to offset operating revenue loss. And the last column reflects the September budget revisions that is currently out for public comments. Next slide, please. Since the pandemic began, Metro has seen more ridership rebound on Metro Bus than on Metro Rail. Although ridership on both Metro Rail and Metro Bus remains significantly below normal levels as shown on slide 4. As a result, Metro has restored and improved service more on bus routes to maintain social distancing. Next slide, please. So slide 5 is one that the committee again has seen before. The slide on the left breaks down Metro's historical fare revenue by mode. And the graph on the right shows that most of Metro rail fare is generated during peak period, which is where ridership has fallen off considerably. Next, please. Indeed, recent survey of Metro rail riders on slide 6 show that pre-pandemic work trips are down 74%, with a 62% increase in telework. Also, just 6% of pre-pandemic riders expect to ride more through the end of this year. The good news is, though, seems to be that 53% of our riders expect to come back to the system once a vaccine becomes available. But combined with the 2 prior slides, this survey seems to suggest that Metro's ridership and revenues will remain depressed in the near term. Next slide, please. So for next fiscal year, staff has laid out on slide 7 3 ridership scenarios: a high, medium, and a low scenario based on factors that we think will drive ridership behavior as discussed with the committee last month. As you'll recall, these factors include the status of the virus, vaccine availability, and how widely such a vaccine is adopted. In September, the board chose the low ridership scenario, which staff used for the September budget revision. We need, as the general manager indicated, a similar direction from the committee here. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will pause in case the committee wishes to deliberate on the scenarios.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Anosike. At this point, I'd like to note that board member Matt Letourneau has joined us. Matt, welcome back from your accident. I think I can speak for all of us on the board that we admire the commitment you're showing in joining us here today, and that we all wish you a continued speedy recovery. We'll get to you when we get to the round of questioning here, but I'm sorry? Okay, I apologize, folks, for that brief interruption there. There's a lot to unpack in the scenario slides here, so why don't we go around? I'll start with Mr. Meridian, your reaction to the scenarios as presented, and if you've got some initial thoughts on what it would be prudent for us to assume.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me echo your sentiments welcoming Mr. Letourneau back. We're all wishing him well. I don't have any questions just yet. I look forward to seeing the continuation of the presentation as we think about the various assumptions. I know that I will have some further questions at that point.
Okay, Mr. Secretary Slater.
Great, thank you, Steve. Let me just kind of ask a question. You know, I'm honing in on some of the assumptions and looking at the telework in particular. You know, I'm just curious as to, you know, that's something we've been looking at and trying to best understand as well as, you know, so have you done any specific kind of outreach on that topic in particular in terms of your customer base and the communities that we serve and trying to understand that?
My understanding is that, you know, telework is one aspect of the survey that our customer service team conducts, as well as rider sentiments in terms of ridership, and particularly work trips, which drives most of our fare revenues. As we discussed last month, we've also looked at what's going on both globally and what's also happening even within the region with respect to traffic flows. So I think we have enough information to indicate that telework is going to increase even more than it was. And as you recall, we're in a region where telework was originally high to begin with compared to other regions. And with the pandemic and the reaction to it, we believe, based on the data that we have now, that telework is going to be with us at an elevated level for the near future.
Sure. No, thank you. And then my only other question is, have we done any specific outreach to about the federal workforce, trying to understand, you know, what the short-term or long-term plans are for the federal government workforce?
I don't have that. You know, my colleague Lynn Balsox may have something, but that's something I can come back to you with. So.
Great, thank you so much. No further questions. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, this is Paul Wiedefeld.
Yes.
If I may, just on a few of those. Yes, we actually meet with the, literally we have calls on a regular basis with the federal government just to get a better sense of what is occurring, you know, at that level, what their plans are. And a lot of what we're also doing is talking directly to users of the systems that are basically registered users. And what they're telling us is that basically, even if offices were to open, they do not plan to come back until basically a vaccine is both available and accepted. And that they plan, because they have the option generally to telework, and that they plan to do that where they can. And if not to telework, that they would probably drive rather than take transit. So that is from conversations and actual data from reaching out to our customers.
Great, thanks so much.
Thanks, Secretary Slater. Next, Chair Smedberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Anaseke, how would a low ridership scenario impact your planning? How do you work that into your ultimate presentation?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The low ridership scenario will assume a level of ridership which will be similar to what the board authorized us to use in September of last year. And as we get into the next few slides, you'll see that the trajectory is lower than the moderate and certainly lower than the high. What it means fundamentally is that, we will expect lower revenues coming in, and therefore the funding gap will be much more significant than under the high scenario. But it also means that, it is conservative and therefore offers us greater opportunity to actually hit those funding and ridership targets.
And Mr. Anoseki, what are you hearing from our funding partners? We know from Secretary Slater, obviously member of the board, they're dealing with a very challenging situation in Maryland. I suspect the same is also true in the Commonwealth of Virginia and in the District of Columbia. And then locally here on the Virginia side, given the way we fund Metro, our localities, I suspect going into 22 or fiscal year 22, that localities and the state and district funding partners are also going to have equally challenging situations, if not more so than they've had this year. How does that figure into what you've presented here today?
Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You are absolutely right. We are hearing significant distress from the funding partners, and we understand and acknowledge that. What we wanted to do today was to offer the scenarios to and engage the committee ultimately in terms of sharing with them the conditions that we think would drive ridership and what that means in terms of developing the budget. The guidance that we get today will then, lead to what additional management actions, what additional board actions, and if there are additional regional actions that the GM will be using to propose his budget next month. But the expectation for today isn't, or rather is to understand the level of comfort for the committee, which will then drive an outcome in terms of funding implications and actions to make sure that the budget that the GM proposes is balanced.
Okay. Maybe this is a question for Secretary Slater. Greg, when do you think you'll have a good sense of what you're looking at for 22, given where we are and when the general manager is presenting a fiscal year 22 budget to this board? Will you have a good sense of where you're going to be at for 22?
We'll have a better sense over the next few weeks. I think we're getting more and more clarity each week. We're kind of smarter today than we were a month ago as things are starting to change. Things are somewhat starting to settle into a pattern, and we're starting to see some of our revenue sources and activities start to come back. But at the same time, we are still looking at basically a 2-year recovery time frame.
And Mr. Meridian, I guess sort of the same question to you. Is that in line with what you're thinking right now, potentially, or where you stand?
It's certainly something that we're looking at very closely. I don't have a definitive.
Yeah, I didn't expect it, but I was just sort of curious.
But yeah, certainly the questions that Secretary Slater is considering are questions that we are also considering.
Yeah, and I know it's the same, for the Commonwealth as well. So, all right, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Next, Mr. Rouse.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we'll have some more specific questions in the following slides, but I would say in terms of some of these baseline assumptions, talking with other transit agencies, two of the ones that stick out to me are obviously what's going on with schools. And being a parent, that's a direct impact to me. And I can tell you, even with flexibility on the federal government side and teleworking and the ability to go back into the office as we start to reopen, with the kid at home, that's just not a realistic option. And so I think one of the major demarcation points will probably be next fall as we get back and to see what schools do on a full-time basis. Even with going to some part-time schedule, it's really difficult to manage that. And so I think that's going to be a major driver. The other one is just to be honest with you, traffic. mean, that if you can drive in 20 minutes, you know, what's the reason to do something else? And I think that's going to be a major driver as more people get on the roads, congestion starts to build again. That's going to be one of the things to look at as we go forward. And I'll have some more questions about that as we get into the particulars of the data. But that's all I've got from this point. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Mr. Bulger.
Tom, you're still on mute. Tom, you're still on mute.
All right, I got it. I think I got it.
You
I
got
just want to pick up what Devin said. Car purchases are up. And federal excise taxes are kind of stable on Highway Trust Fund. Third thing is, look like we're not going to get another stimulus, CARES Act 2, unless something out of the sky falls in the next, after the election. So, and Devin's point about the schools is particularly important for the district. As Jeff knows, we don't have a school bus fleet per se in the district, and reopening the schools, I think, is very important for Metro and DC. Thanks.
Mr. Goldman, you're next.
Thank you. I'm back online. Internet is up, and you can both see me and hear me. I guess my first comment would be, I'm not sure of the value of management consulting with the 8 of us to determine what the ridership levels will be for a year away from now in FY 2022, the year beginning July 1st, 2021. I would think the better sources to consult with would be the Fed projections, epidemiologists, and APTA, which I believe has some medical experts on retainer. Having said that, what I will say is that I listened to a presentation last night by Neil Kashari, who's one of the presidents of one of the regional Fed banks and who was a Treasury official during the 2008-2009 Great Recession. And if I understood his presentation accurately, he was saying that he, and I assume the Fed doesn't foresee any major changes in labor activity and people going back to work till the end of next year, the end of 2021, which is when they assume that there will be a vaccine available, will be available in a widespread pattern of service. So if that be the case, I guess so where I would be pointing management is to retain the low ridership levels that we're projecting for the first 6 months of next year in our existing budget through the end of the year, which I understand is what about in rail about 20 or 25% of pre-COVID ridership levels and maybe 35 to 40% of pre-COVID levels for bus, and then project a gradual increase in ridership for the first 6 months of 2022, but capping out, at around 75 or 85% of pre-COVID levels, because I don't see us getting back to pre-COVID levels, that quickly. I think it's going to take a couple of years, as Mr. Rouse points out, once people get used to fairly low traffic levels and find it easier to drive and find working from home more attractive than commuting in, and employers getting comfortable with that kind of method of doing business. I think it's going to be a couple years before our system gets back to the pre-COVID ridership levels. So summarize, I would continue the low ridership forecast for the first 6 months of the fiscal year you're talking about, and then some gradual increase for the last 6 months of FY 2022.
Thank you, Mr. Goldman, and thank you for the most heroic attempt to give the kind of feedback we were looking for there, notwithstanding your misgivings. Mr. Letourneau.
Hey there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. First of all, thanks, Steve and others for the kind words. Glad to be kind of easing back into things a little bit. It's going to be a long road to get all the way back, but appreciate everybody's kind words and thoughts and so on. So just to kind of pick up on this, just so I understand from a kind of a process standpoint here, is there a point in time when staff will be asking the board to essentially pick one of the scenario assumptions like we had to do for 21?
That's essentially what we're doing now. We're not voting on this, but this is meant to give us some exposure to the factors staff are considering after consultation with the expert, polling our people, et cetera. And, the budget will be developed over the next month, 6 weeks or so, but they are asking for our guidance on how pessimistic or optimistic, conservative to be on these assumptions.
And, do you think there will be, though, an opportunity to perhaps adjust this down the road as we get into calendar year 21?
It's my belief, and Dennis, Paul, you can amplify this, that given the massive uncertainty, we will probably be taking at least a couple looks at the 22 budget, just as we've been doing in FY21.
Yeah.
Dennis, any reaction to that?
Mr. Chairman, this is
Go ahead, Paul.
Paul Wiedefeld. Yes, we will obviously be doing, at a minimum quarterly updates on the budget, but it's important to understand that it is much easier to bring things back in than if we, in 3 months, we'd say, okay, now we've got to cut more. It's much easier to bring people back, bring service back up than vice versa. So, keep that in mind.
Yeah, and so that's Paul. That's kind of what I was going next, which was just to say, as much as I would hope that the low scenario assumption is not reality, especially in terms of some of the assumptions like widespread resurgence and the vaccine not being available until later than expected, I almost think we kind of have to use that as the planning baseline like we did with 21. Just because, as you just said, it's easier to bring things back than it is to cut them. So I think we kind of, at this point in time, if we had to pick a scenario, I think it probably should be the worst one, the low case. And then hopefully we can build from that during the budget process as we understand better. We may know by the time we even get into work sessions whether there's a vaccine, for instance, depending on who you believe. So, but that would probably be my initial thought, if that's helpful.
It is. Thank you, Mr. Turno. Any more comments at this stage?
Nope.
Okay. And just my own quick reaction as I look at the assumptions, even for the medium and high, those are pretty dire compared to the pre-COVID outlook we were dealing with. I guess I find myself thinking that, the top of the medium and high scenarios seem more plausible to me, given that we're talking about, the time period, July of 21 through June of 22. But what would steer me towards the right hand of that chart, towards the low, is, as others have expressed, a desire to be conservative, prudent, and do the hard work first. And if things turn out better, look for those opportunities. With that, Dennis, why don't you go ahead and complete your presentation, which is
moving from the scenarios into the budgetary implications of those scenarios?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So based on the slide that you're looking at here, slide 8, and using the low ridership scenario, then Metro will assume that ridership for next year will initially be at 78.5 million trips. And consistent with the low ridership scenario, on slide 9 here, we're showing the projected revenues at $169.4 million for next year, which is about $450 million below Metro's pre-pandemic fare revenues. Slide 10, Mr. Chairman, captures the projected ridership scenarios for next year and the corresponding revenue estimates. In addition, staff is projecting nominal improvements in parking and advertising revenues, which are two revenue streams that are most correlated to ridership. And as we do with each financial planning process, slide 11 identifies major inputs as well as risks inherent in Metro's fiscal year 2022 operating budget. Starting on the left side of the page, ongoing pandemic impacts, collective bargaining agreement cost increases, as well as operating cost increases will all be part of Metro's budget, requiring no additional regional funding. Paratransit cost at this time is expected to remain within last year's funding levels, based on what we are seeing with respect to ridership and demand. However, the budget will assume that subsidy credit that was provided last year would be restored, along with a 3% capped increase in the subsidy level. Slide 12 shows the service level and frequencies approved by this committee last month, and which the GM's budget proposal for fiscal year 2022 will be based on. The only change at this time will be the initiation of Silver Line Phase 2 service, which my colleague, Ms. Mason, spoke about earlier today. Again, based on the committee's direction on the likely ridership scenario, Metro's fiscal year 2022 funding outlook would look as stated in slide 13, using the low ridership column, which is in red. The first two rows represent the restoration of the one-time subsidy credit and the annual 3% baseline growth on subsidy. Operating revenues, again, going back to the low ridership scenario, is expected to increase by $60 million. But we have not assumed the renewal of CARES Act in this estimate, which then leaves a funding gap of $314 million for next fiscal year. Staff is also anticipating about $131 million in cost increases for the pandemic, the CBA cost increases, baseline inflation, as well as bringing cinder bed garage operations back in-house and initiating Silver Line Phase 2 operations, including the $36.5 million of preventive maintenance funds that was used to supplement funding for Silver Line in the current fiscal year. These additional costs will be reduced by $100 million, as you see in that column, which is the result of the management as well as service reduction changes that will be implemented in fiscal year 2021. Overall, that leaves a funding gap under that scenario of $345 million that Metro will have to close by the time the GM proposes his budget next month. Slide 14 shows preliminary operating subsidy for next fiscal year based on the scenario that I just laid out, with the subsidy credit again in column 3 and the 3% subsidy growth in column 5. Again, these numbers are very, very preliminary and will change, again, based on the ultimate service structure that's proposed and ultimately adopted by the, approved by the board. The budget for fiscal year 2022 that the general manager will propose next month would include time for full public outreach within COVID guidelines and a formal Title VI equity analysis beginning in January of 2021. And finally, Mr. Chairman, slide 16 shows the initial timeline for the budget process. That concludes my remarks, and I'll be glad to respond to any questions.
Thank you. I'll start. I just want to emphasize, if we could go back to slide 12 and make sure everyone is, make sure we're completely transparent about how slides 12, 13, and 14 should be read together here. So we will be considering policy regarding service and fares as we get into the budget cycle. But this is the starting point from which that policy discussion will proceed. And this is the starting point for the calculations that you see on slide 13 for the projected operating deficit and funding gap. Likewise, on slide 14, the scenarios we're starting with is an assumption that the jurisdictions will be providing the subsidies as laid out on that slide. To the extent in these, to the extent we have fiscal challenges in the jurisdictions and anybody wants to look at that, that also will affect the size of the budget gap. But this is the starting point that led to that gap discussion. So trying, you know, it's more urgent this year than usual to make sure that we're all on the same page and understanding these assumptions at the beginning of the process. So just wanted to highlight that. We'll do another round here. Given that we've already done one round on this item, I would encourage folks to be brief, but if there are you know, observations or clarifications you need on this part of the presentation, this is your opportunity to do that. First of many opportunities to do that. Start with Mr. Meridian.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dennis, thanks for the presentation. Can you just clarify, and this speaks to a point that Mr. Letourneau made earlier, if we were to go with a medium or high scenario and ridership levels did not come back as anticipated, what would the budgetary implications be?
So if you go to slide 13, I believe, as Steve laid out, this is where we summarize the financial implications of the scenarios. So if you go with the high scenario, for example, that means WMATA, and assuming all of the other inputs that are, or accepting all of the other inputs that are identified here, that means that WMATA needs to close a $167 million gap, right? Without, I mean, and this does not ask the jurisdictions for additional funds. It simply lays out the fact, which is there is this $167 million gap that needs to be closed. How we close that will be a matter of board policy, right? But on the other extreme, if we proceed as directed with a low ridership scenario, that means we need to close a $345 million gap.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, this is Paul Wiedefeld again.
Yep.
If I could just add, so Jeff, to your point, so under the scenario, the high scenario, the 167 million, if the ridership does not come back at that level, that number obviously would grow to whatever, whatever would be to the right there, 238 through 45 or somewhere in between. What we would then have to do is go back out and basically hold public hearings, Title VI analysis of any cuts we were going to make to try to deal with that issue, or other funding sources would have to come in to make up that difference.
Thank you. And that was really my question is, would we potentially be in a scenario where we'd be looking at further cuts?
Yes, unless we were to get additional local dollars in effect, that would be the only avenue we would have.
Got it. Thanks. And I just have one more brief question, Paul, to the point you were making earlier about the frequent communication with the feds. Are we thinking, has the topic of the longer term been raised in terms of how the federal government might adjust? I know we're thinking kind of more in the immediate term, but have we thought about bigger picture way down the horizon?
There has been some talk of that, and yes, there is, I think, a general agreement that our ridership will not get back to pre-COVID levels, literally for a few years, and some of it's what's happening in the federal workforce. Some of it's just people have made different life choices, whatever they've done. So I think in talking to other, both in terms of other transit properties, what we've seen internationally, a little bit further ahead of us, that seems to be where the new normal is. So we will have to deal with that issue ongoing. But the most immediate concern right now is how do we deal with a budget, that we're preparing that has, a fairly, I think, reasonable assumption that, this thing isn't going to turn around in the next year timeframe to 18 months, and that we have to take actions now to meet a balanced budget.
Great. Thanks. Mr. Chairman, I don't have any further questions.
Thank you. Next, Secretary Slater.
Thank you. Most of my questions were really answered. I had the same line of questioning that Mr. Meridian had, but kind of on the other end, on the reverse side of that, if we were fortunate enough to get another CARES Act and we made these adjustments, how would we kind of manage that scenario?
Yes. Again, this is Paul Wiedefeld. Yes, that's exactly, we would, again, it's easier to pull back than basically have to go back out. So if another act comes, whether it's in between now and December, it would adjust what we would put on the table. If it occurs, in early spring, for instance, next year, again, we would then say, okay, but we don't need to do those types of cuts. We can keep that service. But if it doesn't occur, obviously we would have to be prepared to do those cuts starting in July.
Sure. Thank you. No further questions for me.
Thanks, Mr. Smedberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For me, I guess my line of questioning, gave it away, and some of the things that Jeff and Greg had just said, and what Dennis has highlighted in this presentation, I think, and for the point that Paul made, I think right now my preference again would be going with the low scenario in this case, and moving forward, taking in a lot of factors here, but I think moving along that direction is the more prudent way to go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks. Mr. Rouse, anything further?
Actually, I think Mr. Meridian actually asked most of the line of questioning I was going to have. I am curious, because some of this is circular logic here, right? We assume one scenario, but it's based on the current service levels that we put out there. And obviously, if we end up having a final gap on the low scenario, we're going to have to make some changes so we can end up having to go back and do this again. The numbers are going to change in terms of frequency and things of that nature. But I'm guessing, kind of in line with the previous slides as well, as how we monitor that, and if we do need to right size, are we looking at data outside of just our ridership data? Are we looking at ADT and local roads, or even predicted travel time from some of the crowdsourcing apps that are out there to see if we're going to start trending in one direction or another?
This is Paul Wiedefeld. There's actually two things that we're tracking. One is, again, travel behavior. And so that, we have a lot of information from the business community that we're working very closely with. The Greater Washington Partnership has created this whole sort of live information feed to us. So that's helpful from that perspective. But the bigger issue is really what's happening on the state and local level. Because again, this budget, these gaps are based on the assumption that the state and local governments will be able to not only meet their current subsidy levels, but also that growth in subsidy levels. So that's the other thing. And that is where, again, I think the board has the best information on that because they represent those governments. And that's the biggest concern, or a very big concern, is whether or not that can be met because these numbers all change if that cannot be. So as they continue to monitor what's happening at the state and local level with their funding sources, that could change, and it could change both ways, just like the federal side, the federal monies could. But if the monies are not as bad, if the financial situation is not as bad on the state and local level from the 22 budget, then maybe they have more room to fill subsidy requests. But if it goes the other way and they continue to have some of the drops they've had, then that may be much harder for them to come up with any additional dollars to bring back service.
Yeah, and one of the factors here is there's obviously a lag there. It's going to take quarters to actually see what that contribution is going to be. And so I guess going back to the question I had was, do we feel that we have enough data that if we have to go back to an exercise of right-sizing the system back in the next quarter or two, are we looking at things other than just our tap in, tap out data to see where we might be able to effectively be efficient in terms of operations and thinking ahead so we have that information in front of us to make an informed decision when that time comes, if it comes?
This is Dennis Anasike. So in answer to your question, sir, yeah, we do have enough. I mean, we're always looking for more and better information, but there are analysis going on right now, and some of which have been going on that will drive operating efficiency across the enterprise, which this is also part of where some of the recommendations that the general manager has made in terms of the $43 million reduction are coming from. So yes, we have some. The challenge is that the most significant part of the operations is service. And so when you're dealing with gaps of this magnitude, you invariably end up, making additional adjustments with respect to service. And when you do that, obviously, you're looking at both where the need is as well as where the rides are occurring.
Yeah, no, I think that's the point I'm getting at. You talked earlier about the broken record aspect of some of the silver line things, and I've kept making this point. I'm going to continue to make this point when we have to make these decisions on right-sizing service. Data is critical, and having that in front of us, not only for the board to make an informed decision, but also for our riders and the general public to kind of see how we've reached these conclusions. That's going to be critical because, again, this is not something that next quarter or two, unfortunately, is going to be any drastic change from what we've seen and what we're even proposing here. So I think that's going to be important, is figuring out any type of information we can have to make informed decisions and putting it in front of us here to help everyone reach the same conclusions.
Thank you.
That's all I have.
Thanks. Next, Mr. Bulger.
I had a kind of wild question for Paul. Do we have any wiggle room on the collective bargaining agreement, given if we have to downsize personnel?
We have been meeting with the unions, particularly 689, and have, basically working through some potential options there. One would be, in effect, unpaid leave. We're not under the current CBA. We're not allowed to do furloughs. We can only do layoffs. So we are working with leadership there to see if there's anything we could do on that end. We're also looking at a potential retirement incentives again, as a way to save jobs, people infill jobs. So we are having those types of discussions. But the CBA, as you know, is in place. So anything we would do would be part of the negotiations with the different unions.
Thank you.
Mr. Goldman.
Thank you, Mr. McMillan. Let me make two comments, one on ridership and its implications, and one on the CARES Act, which we've already discussed. These presentation slides treat riders as interchangeable. And I think we need a much more fine-tuned analysis of riders in relationship to revenue in this budget. What I'm getting at is that a rider on Metrobus pays a different fare than a rider on Metro Rail. There's get much more revenue from the rail rider than the bus rider. And so in projecting what revenue is going to be, I think we need to drill down and get a better forecast from management of where the ridership is going to be to get a better sense, a more accurate sense of the revenue. Related to that is, I guess, a comment about some of our ridership, especially on the long haul segments, and this is a comment Mr. Rouse has made, looks more like a commuter rail system than an intercity subway system. I'm talking about commuters coming in from Shady Grove on the Red Line or on the Silver Line, or from the outer stations on the Orange Line. And in New York, the MTA has, in a presentation that I saw, pointed out that there are drops in ridership on the Metro North commuter rail line that they operate, and the Long Island Railroad that they operate has been much greater than on the downtown MTA subway. And I think we may see similar patterns in the ridership numbers that we're getting under COVID. So if that be true, we're going to get less revenue. Less of those riders are going to mean less revenue because they're the ones paying the higher fares coming in from the outer stations. And so I think that has to be looked at as you develop a forecast, because that may mean that the actual operating pattern, should be different. If the riders aren't out there coming in from the far out stations, maybe we don't need as much service there as compared to on the Red Line from Union Station around to DuPont Circle. So I think we need a little more detail, a little more depth in developing these numbers going forward to when the general manager presents an actual budget with ridership and revenue forecasts in November. Second comment on Fares Act money, as this chart shows that's on the screen, this is big bucks. We're talking about $500 million if there are to be CARES Act funds. And that's going to have a dramatic impact on what a service plan and a budget is going to look like. So rather than going on just one assumption, I guess my suggestion, my recommendation should be that we develop a budget with, two alternatives. An alternative that assumes that there won't be CARES Act money, which will result in very significant, probably cutbacks in service and in jobs, and a alternative two, which assumes that there will be replacement CARES Act funding that will come along, probably not at the end of the year, but probably early next year, that would be available for us for the FY22 budget. So I guess I'm suggesting, as opposed to what the general manager and Dennis were suggesting before, that going on one assumption and building it back in, if the CARES Act money comes along, to actually develop a CARES Act budget scenario and a non-CARES Act budget scenario as a way to move forward in November. That's all I have.
Thanks, Mr. Goldman. And Mr. Letourneau.
You there, Matt?
Yeah, so I think Dan was muting me. Please don't, Dan, because I can mute my phone myself, so I didn't realize I was muted. Anyway, I don't have too much more to add. I think Devin's on the right track, and I had brought this up before too about actual road traffic levels, because I think that more than anything is probably going to dictate the choices that people make. Right now, it's pretty easy to drive into, urban areas and, in DC because traffic is a lot less, but we need to be watching that carefully. I think, at this point, I mean, Michael makes a reasonable point about how all these riders probably aren't equal. We probably do need more analysis about who's coming where. And then, what type of service does this actually mean, looking at, these type of gaps. So, personally, if I just, look closely at the sort of medium and the low, there's a pretty big gap there between, a 238 million and a 345 million gap. I tend to think that the low is maybe a little overboard. And I'd probably like to see something kind of in between the medium and low as an initial kind of baseline for guidance. But I think the more information we can get about exactly who is using the system now, what the trips look like themselves, how far they're going. And then I think this is an opportunity. I mean, I've wanted to really talk about fare policy for a while. Obviously, things are very wacky now, but this is an opportunity to look at, potentially some fare policy things that could help enhance ridership and enhance revenue. So, such as family passes and things like that. So, I think all that needs to be on the table. It for me.
All right, thank you. And we will, with that, close out discussion on this item and move on to the capital improvement plan presentation. Jennifer, are we swapping out a board member for this one?
Yes, sir. We will be bringing back Mr. Horner.
All right, so Ms. Mason, if you could give us a few seconds to let Mr. Horner get on the line and then proceed. Or I guess,
I'm sorry, but before we leave the other topic,
yes,
I just need to make sure that I'm getting the clear direction that we need so that we can come back with what the board wants to see. So if I could just summarize it to make sure that I am clear on that.
We were going to revisit this in exec session as well. Okay. You can do that now, or we can do that later.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay. Let's hold off then. Jennifer, if you could just let us know when we're ready to proceed.
Will do. You may proceed. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Again, we have a staff presentation on the capital improvement
plan from Mr. Webster and Ms. Mason. Please proceed.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. My name is Tom Webster, Metro's Executive Vice President for Strategy, Planning, and Program Management. This morning, we will provide the committee with an update on Metro's capital program, near-term major projects, and planning for major priority projects currently in the design phases. I'll begin the presentation with an update on the status of the capital program overall, and then my colleague Laura Mason will discuss our upcoming major projects. So Metro's capital program is and remains focused on safety, reliability, and state of good repair projects and rehabilitation programs. And after some initial capital delivery impacts to some projects due to the pandemic, Metro's capital programs and projects have resumed. And in fact, in several program areas, we've been able to accelerate state of good repair work and programs during the period of lower ridership. Metro invested about $1.7 billion in FY20 last fiscal year, and our current forecast for the current fiscal year FY21 is between 1.9 and 2 billion. We've taken action to defer some projects that will not have an impact on safety or state of good repair in order to preserve about 30 million, given the operating budget financial challenges. And looking ahead, we're advancing several critical and overdue safety and state of good repair projects focused on platforms, structures, and systems. During FY20 and in early FY21, Metro, we continued our progress on the delivery of key safety and state of good repair projects. We're now through the first two phases of our platform rehabilitation program, and we've restored deteriorated platforms to a like-new condition and have reopened those stations to service. In the spring, we received the 748th and final 7000 series railcar, continuing to improve the reliability of our railcar fleet. We continued our bus replacement and rehabilitation programs to support safety and reliability of the Metro bus fleet. And we've begun to advance the two key projects to replace obsolete bus divisions at Northern and Bladensburg. We advanced the office consolidation program to consolidate our office facilities in 3 locations, one each in the district, Maryland and Virginia. Looking ahead to the remainder of our current fiscal year and our next 6-year capital program, our program outlook remains again focused on safety and state of good repair projects. Importantly, we have advanced the planning and development of several major projects to address our key core unmet capital needs and priorities over the next several years. In addition to our recurring rehabilitation and replacement programs, we will advance major projects to address key systems and structures priorities, including train control systems, additional platform reconstruction projects, bridge and tunnel rehabilitation, and a pilot for ventilation system improvements. Our current forecast for FY21 capital investment again is 1.9 to 2 billion, and our outlook for the next 6 years shows a ramp up of investment for those critical projects over the next few years to over 2 billion. The preliminary forecast here assumes no change to the forecast for jurisdictional contributions to the capital program. Forecast also assumes, importantly, an amendment to the FY21 capital budget this winter to support both the platform and train control programs. This amendment will be supported by dedicated funding debt and will not require additional funding from the jurisdictions. This forecast also shows that federal PREA funding has not yet been reauthorized, but it's clearly essential to our financial plan to support safety and state of good repair needs and projects going forward. Next year's 150 million is in the continuing resolution, and our congressional delegation is working hard, of course, on reauthorization efforts. Most importantly, the dedicated funding provided by the region for Metro's capital program allows Metro and the region to advance critical safety and state of good repair projects. The ability to use the dedicated funding to issue long-term debt to support the program both adds capacity to address overdue capital needs and also allows Metro to advance critical projects when they're ready for implementation rather than having to wait for future uncertain funding at a time when those needs are due or overdue. For next steps for the capital program, we will return to the committee this fall with the updated FY22 to 27 capital program. We will publish the detailed one-year capital budget, 6-year capital program, and 10-year capital plan outlook. And we will, of course, support the committee's efforts to review the capital program and the budget, as well as the required public hearing process in advance of the board's adoption of the program and budget in the March timeframe. And with that, I'll turn the presentation over to my colleague, Laura Mason, to discuss project delivery and upcoming major projects.
Thank you, Tom. So this afternoon, I would like to talk about project execution planning, particularly focused on the near-term efforts, those projects that will take place in FY21 and 22. There are 6 projects I'm going to focus on today, 2 that are in the design and procurement stages for our ATC train control room replacement and yellow line tunnel and bridge rehabilitation. We then have 4 projects that we will see heavy construction in FY21 and 22, and that is the balance of the platform program, tunnel ventilation pilot, aerial structure rehabilitation, and the Rockville canopy replacement. I'll go through each of these in detail and then again address the service impacts at the end of the presentation. So some quick highlights on each room or on each project. The first project is our automatic train control room replacements. We have about 25 rooms that are in urgent need of replacement. So we are planning this in 2 phases. The first phase is 10 rooms and the second phase will be 15 rooms. In total for these 25 rooms, we are expecting rough order of magnitude $280 million project, including all of our soft costs and implementation support costs. NTP for the first phase, we are looking at this winter. It is a design build contract. We're looking to award this winter in December in order to support lengthy design and manufacturing processes, which would support installation and construction service impacts likely in the fall of 2022, which would be in early fiscal 23. The photographs you see on the right give an indication of the type of equipment that are in the rooms. In addition to having to replace all of this equipment and its associated wiring, this project also includes replacement of the components on the wayside, i.e. in the track bed that this room connects to and controls. Second project I would like to highlight is the rehabilitation of the yellow line tunnel liner. This is a very significant project and a very complex one. This is the tunnel that moves outbound from Font Plaza out to the bridge over the river. It is a very complex construction, and so we have decided to do this via construction manager at risk contract. We'll be issuing a competitive design procurement shortly in order to have it on the designer on board by the spring of 2021, followed quickly by a procurement for a CMAR, and looking to have the construction manager on board by the end of this fiscal year, so by the end of June. We think the construction manager at risk is the right choice for this project because it will allow us to leverage the CMAR's expertise to reduce cost and the service impacts by leveraging early construction planning in the early stages of design. The next project is the Platform Improvement Project, Phase 3. This was briefed in the June 2020 board meeting, so I will not spend much time here. I wanted to include it, though, for completeness as we look at our major projects for FY21 and 22. This project has been bid, and we are anticipating awarding Phase 3 next week. The service impacts will be felt starting in mid-February when we shut down Arlington Cemetery Station and Addison Road. We will bypass around Addison Road with a single track to continue to serve the outer blue silver line at Morgan Boulevard and Largo. That will take place mid-February to mid-May. And in the summer, we will shut down the Green Line stations north of Fort Totten, similar to how we have done the previous summer shutdowns south of National and this summer west of Ballston. Following Phase 3, we have Platform Improvement Project Phase 4. This was also briefed in the June 2020 board meeting. Just quickly, it is going to take place in the summer of 2022 and will involve the closure of all Orange Line stations east of Minnesota Avenue. And it will be a 3-month shutdown. Part of why it is key now in FY21 is that we intend to award this contract in fall or winter in FY21 in order to support long lead times to design and construct the aerial structure just inbound of Cheverly Station. This is an aerial structure that has seen significant deterioration, and it crosses both wetlands and CSX tracks, requiring significant coordination and design permitting. The next project is the tunnel ventilation system modifications. Over time, since our tunnels and our underground structures were installed, the NFPA standards have changed, which means we need to increase the amount of tunnel ventilation that we have. We have leveraged advanced computational models to determine how to best increase the ventilation, as much of the structures above our underground tunnels are already built in. What we've identified is a solution that we think can work, where we will add additional fans to our vent shafts and increase the ventilation without adding new surface connections. We are going to pilot this between Woodley Park and Cleveland Park to confirm that we do actually get the increase in ventilation projected by the models. And assuming that verification is completed, we will expand the program to cover the rest of the underground system. The graphic on your right of the slide shows the egress times. This is what is guiding our decision. These egress times reflect how long it would take to evacuate the tunnel if there were a smoke and fire incident. It reflects both the crowding on that segment of the line, but also the depth, the distance to a nearest exit, and the estimated evacuation time. For this project, we are looking to do a major outage in the summer of 2022 and have continuous single tracking between Van Ness and DuPont stations in order to build the structure necessary to support these fans. It's quite invasive work, and we anticipate doing a 4 to 6 week continuous single tracking event to create that safe workspace, so it's such that the program can continue working without interfering with the tracks. Looking ahead, likely in the spring of 2022, we would have a series of weekend shutdowns to install these fans and commission the system and begin that verification testing. This is a project that has been in the works for many years. It's a problem that is quite difficult to tackle. So we are excited to now be at a point where we are ready to issue a design build contract for this pilot. The next project is aerial structure rehabilitations. We have a number of bridges that are past their useful life and have seen significant degradation. These are our highest priority for our State of Good Repair program. There are 9 aerial locations, 4 on the green line, 4 on the blue line, and 1 on the red line. All of these have been designed, so this will be issued as an IFB contract following design bid build methodology. In total for these structures, we anticipate a rough order magnitude cost of $80 to $100 million. And we anticipate the work taking place between the fall of 2021 through the spring of 2022. The service impacts of this project are primarily weekend shutdowns, as the bulk of the work can be completed from below. However, we will see sustained weekend shutdowns in each location in order to complete the work. In addition to those aerial structures, we will also be including the Rockville canopy replacement in the same contract, but I'm briefing them as 2 separate projects as they have quite a different impact on service. The Rockville canopy, as shown in the upper right, has seen significant corrosion, leaks, and failure of the roofing membrane, which means it needs to be demolished and replaced. The rough order magnitude cost for this project is $25 to $35 million, and as I said, will be included as part of the design bid build project with the aerial structures. However, in order to do this work, we will need to close Rockville Station for the fall of 2021 and potentially into the winter of 2022. We intend to start with a continuous shutdown, which means Rockville and Shady Grove stations will be closed starting in September. And we are still evaluating whether the shutdown should be between 30 and 90 days as we look at how to best complete this project. Once we have completed the most invasive work over the tracks, we will reopen Shady Grove Station, keep Rockville closed, and bypass it. And we expect to continue that and wrap up the work here likely in January or February of 2022. So now that I've covered the projects and why they are necessary, I'm going to repeat a lot of that information, but focus on it from a customer or rider perspective by talking to it as the outages that they will experience. So our next major outage is in mid-February and will last through mid-May of 2021. And this is for the Platform 3 project, their phase 1. Arlington Cemetery Station will be closed, and there will be no blue line service. Yellow line trains will service Franconia, Springfield, and Van Dorn stations. In addition, Addison Road Station will be closed and bypassed, such that Morgan Boulevard and Largo will still be serviced by the Silver Line. And that is anticipated to last approximately 3 months. Following the completion of phase 1, we will move into phase 2, which is our summer shutdown from Memorial Day to Labor Day of 2021. And that is the closure of the Green Line stations north of Fort Totten. That's West Hyattsville through Greenbelt. Midway through the summer, and approximately mid-July, we anticipate starting another event, which is the continuous single tracking between DuPont Circle and Van Ness stations on the Red Line. And this is to enable us to tackle the installation of the platform for the tunnel ventilation project. After Labor Day and the restoration of the Platform 3 area on the Green Line, we will then close Rockville and Shady Grove stations, as well as Shady Grove Yard, to begin the Rockville Canopy Replacement Project. The Rockville station itself will be closed for all of the fall through January 2022. The reopening of Shady Grove Station is still under development as we evaluate our options to best complete this project. In addition to the work on the Upper Red Line, this is when we will see the work begin for the aerial structure rehabilitations, which will take the form of approximately 10 weekend shutdowns distributed across those structures. The small black circles that you see on that graphic, each one of those represents one of the aerial structures that needs to be rehabilitated. Looking further ahead into late winter and spring of 2022, after Rockville Canopy Replacement is complete and that station has reopened, the aerial structure rehabilitation work will shift to the Grosvenor aerial structure between Grosvenor Station and Medical Center, as well as the aerial structure that is outbound of Stadium Armory, affecting service between Eastern Market and Cheverly and Addison Road stations. These are more complex structures and will require more time, roughly 5 weekend shutdowns each. Finally, looking ahead to the summer of 2022, so this will be the beginning of fiscal 23, we will see, starting Memorial Day, the Platform 4 project, which will be a shutdown of all the Orange Line stations east of Stadium Armory, so that is Minnesota Avenue to New Carrollton. Also this summer is when we anticipate beginning to see the construction and service impacts for the Yellow Line tunnel and bridge rehabilitation, which will likely require a closure of the Yellow Line between LaFont Plaza and Pentagon. We do not yet know the extent of these service impacts. That will be defined during 2021 once we have our designer and construction manager at risk on board. So in summary, over FY21 and 22, we have 5 major outages planned, as well as significant weekend outages planned to address our aerial structures. Looking ahead to FY23, we will also see significant work on the Yellow Line tunnel and bridge rehabilitation, as well as the start of the construction phase of the automatic train control room replacement program. These are just the major projects that will have the most significant impact to service. We do also have many other projects that are part of the capital program, which will be briefed later. And with that, Tom and I are happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. If we could go back to stay on that summary slide for a minute. So thinking about ideal project delivery, you're going to get as many of these necessary things done as soon as possible, sliding those boxes towards the left, but having them as short as possible and with the least overlap as possible to minimize service impacts. Is that a reasonable summary?
Yes, we are doing them as quickly as we can because all of these affect safety. We do have to be mindful of the interactions between their service impacts. So we are keeping them end to end and overlapping them where we think it is safe and feasible.
Right. So
Tom briefly mentioned the opportunity that the dedicated funding debt financing provides to give you that schedule flexibility. Without going into too much detail, in an alternative world where we were, smoothing the cash flow in the capital plan and keeping it at that at a constant level rather than giving you the flexibility to surge in certain years when big projects come along. What would this chart look like in terms of service disruption, and how far to the right would some of these projects have shifted without this funding flexibility?
So I think without this funding and flexibility to scale our program to meet our needs, we would be faced with some very difficult decisions about which safety projects to tackle first, whether it was more important to rehabilitate our structures or to work on our tunnel ventilation and safety of the underground system. What we would look at with Tom is the funding available and how to distribute the projects. It would be a less efficient way to execute the work, which all told would result in increased capital costs, although they would be spread out over a longer period of time, likely over multiple years, not just into 22, but really pushing into 23 and 24.
And would you characterize some of these as playing catch up, things that should have been done a long time ago, or just things that are coming up because we're nearing the end of the normal service life of some of these assets?
I would characterize all of the projects briefed today as overdue. There are things that we have known, many of which we have developed the designs for, but did not have the funding or the capacity to deliver the project. Many of the investments we have made in the last year is actually related to our capacity to deliver large-scale capital program. So what you're seeing here is the results of that investment and the ability to ramp up and tackle these overdue problems.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. Moving on to Mr. Meridian.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Teresa and Tom, as always, for your excellent presentation. I think it's encouraging to see the level of collaboration that's happening amongst the two different components here within the organization. To the point that that the chairman made, and just to follow up a little bit more on your response, do we have is there a prioritization framework for these types of projects in the event of the worst case scenario in which some projects would have to go to the back burner because of funding?
In that circumstance where we are constrained, we would look at sort of the risk matrix around deferral and sequencing of these projects differently. I think, just to repeat again something Laura said, these are all high priority projects that score very high in our prioritization methodology. To date, it's been a question of resources and the implementation plan to deliver them. But these are just at the absolute top of our prioritization.
This is Paul Wiedefeld. Jeff, if I could just weigh in a little bit. These are the types of projects that if we don't do them as quickly as we can do them, as we're all trying to rebound, hopefully in the near future, we could have some serious issues at some of these locations, which then could obviously push us further back in our rebound. So that's why I think the sooner we get these done from a safety standpoint and from a future revenue and bringing people back and not having them come back to a system that's under some dramatic repair, the sooner the better.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, I think it's clear that these are priority, high urgency projects, and it's great to see the focus on them. Thanks. I don't have any further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Secretary Slater.
Good, thank you. Just building a little bit on Mr. Meridian's question, I assume, not only would deferring these create safety challenges, but also create a situation where to alleviate them will be much more expensive and much more impactful to our riders. Is that correct?
That is correct, particularly with the structures. If those were to be taken out unexpectedly and we then had to start the process of contracting for the replacement, you would see much bigger impacts to service as they were out of service for much longer. We do not want to take any of these structures out of service.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Great presentation for both.
Okay, Mr. Smedberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just add my name to Jeff's comments. Obviously, these are, very important projects, and as Laura and Paul have highlighted, and as I and others have said in the past, I don't think we want the authority to go back to the days where they were putting off capital projects, particularly these important capital projects. So we maintain a state of good repair and safety moving forward, and don't push these off. So those are my comments for now. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Horner.
Thank you, Steve. So what percentage of the proceeds from the dedicated revenue bonds does the cost of these critical projects represent? Is it 10% of proceeds, 50% of proceeds? Do you have a sense?
So it's Mr. Horner, we're going to have to follow up as we prepare the detailed budget for the upcoming fiscal years. In general, the dedicated funding and dedicated funding debt will support a significant portion of this work. But these projects are also eligible for FTA grant funding and PREA funding, so it will be likely a combination. But we can follow up with more specific detail later.
David, if I understood your question correctly, you weren't necessarily asking about the funding source, but the magnitude as compared to the magnitude of the dedicated funding source, right?
It was just what I've heard mention of the, let me put it this way, we've congratulated ourselves for undertaking the bonding of the dedicated revenue in order to afford the agency flexibility in delivering these critical projects and not being constrained by a mother may I year-to-year funding approach. But I wanted to understand specifically what percentage of the capital raise, what percentage of the proceeds from the bonding will be expended to deliver these projects that we're discussing today. Do we have a sense, roughly 10%, 30%? I'm also hearing that maybe the source of funding for some of these projects would not be the proceeds from the bond issuance, but federal sources or still other sources. So maybe we put the question a different way. What's the source of funding for these projects that we're discussing today?
Mr. Horner, I appreciate the question. It will be a combination of dedicated funding, bond proceeds, and very likely federal formula and PREA grants. We're in the process now of aligning planned fund sources to our expenditure forecast for the upcoming years, and we'll have more detail on those breakdowns at that point.
Okay. The reason, what I'd like to do is introduce a thought, like a point of caution. I don't think we should praise the bonding of the dedicated funding sources too much. That transaction does not come without a cost to the funding jurisdictions. I mean, by entering into this financing, the funding jurisdictions are precluded from repurposing dedicated funding in response to their respective fiscal crises as a result of the pandemic. So, I'm trying to understand the extent to which there really is a benefit with respect to these projects from the bond offering. And it sounds like the answer is to come. Is that right, Tom?
Yeah, certainly the detail on how much we will be leveraging and what share of dedicated funding then goes towards debt service will be part of the detail that follows. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I have no other questions.
Great. Mr. Bolger.
I don't have any questions. Unmuting is not easy. Thanks.
Understood. Mr. Goldman.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom and Laura, for your presentation. I just wanted to follow up with the conversation I was having this morning with Joe Leader on the performance and on the arcing incidents and fires on the red line and the grouting in the tunnel project, major capital project to begin south of Medical Center. And I believe I heard Mr. Leader say that that was scheduled for the second half of FY22. And I didn't see it as part of your slides in your presentation today, but can you just confirm when that will begin in FY22 and where it will start and what the impact will be on service on the red line?
Sure, Mr. Goldman. What we're looking at is that because that affects the red line and the complexity of working around the Rock Hill canopy as well as the Grosvenor aerial structures, the earliest we could begin that work is, as Mr. Leader said, late FY22. So looking at the spring, April, May, June timeframe. We are working with Mr. Webster and his group to identify the funding. So we are looking at late 22, FY23. Typically, what we have done with that leak mitigation work is evening and weekend single tracking.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not going to likely rise to the level of being a major outage, which we define as 5 consecutive days or affecting weekday peak service.
And where will the initial construction grouting be? That will be in the area south of Medical Center going towards Bethesda and moving south? Is that and so the initial affected stations would be Bethesda and Friendship Heights in that area?
Actually, the two top priority areas are between Friendship Heights and Tenleytown stations,
okay,
between Silver Spring and Forest Glen. And so what we will look at is in combination with what is happening on Platform 4, as well as other track work events that are planned, we will determine whether to start on the eastern or western side first.
And the impact of that would be to reduce the arcing incidents on the red line going north from DuPont Circle. That would have an immediate impact in reducing those kind of safety issues and those kind of threats.
Yes, so what we are looking at when we do that project for leak mitigation is it's really about preventing water intrusion into the tunnels, which affects arcing insulators as it keeps water out. Water and electricity obviously do not mix well. It also has the benefit of prolonging the life of our assets as the standing water and muck that come in affect increased corrosion that we see and degradation of our track components. So it is both safety as well as state of good repair.
And so we should be able to get some impact on the level of those arcing incidents by the end of FY22, early FY23 as a result of the grouting project.
Given the duration to complete the project, I think the benefits would be realized probably in 2023.
In 2023. Right. Okay. Thank you. Appreciate that update. We'll look forward to the project. Thanks.
And Mr. Letourneau.
Thanks, Steve. So I think in general, compared to before when I was not on the board and now, I think capital delivery is a clear sign of an improved process and department at Metro. And there should be hopefully greater public confidence in the ability of Metro to complete projects compared to a few years ago, as evidenced by the successful projects on platform reconstruction, which I'm very happy now are moving to Maryland. But the one question I do have is there's been discussions of a really more of a strategic plan, sort of a 10-year strategic plan that all the jurisdictions can understand and kind of buy into. And I really haven't heard much about that. This is a good update today on sort of some of the things that are in the pipeline. But does staff have any update on really more of a longer term strategic plan that can be discussed within the region and with the jurisdictions?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Letourneau. There are a number of efforts underway on this point. Last year, we published our updated 10-year capital needs forecast that laid out needs and priorities over roughly a 10-year period. This year, in the November, December, January timeframe, we will be publishing three components. One, the normal capital budget. Two, the 6-year program that outlines projects, scope, schedule, budgets, cost estimates, and the reasons why we're pursuing the projects or project justifications. And then we've begun an effort to look out 10 years at both at a combination of projects, programs, and needs to lay out for the jurisdictions and all of our stakeholders all of the work that could happen over the 10-year period on a somewhat unconstrained basis, and again, including both projects that are developed and understood and moving through or to implementation, as well as future needs that are still in sort of the development stage. So we recognize the importance of having that longer term view, and look forward to talking with the jurisdictions about that.
Okay, and will that be something that will come to the board in
Yes.
that November, December, January timeframe? Okay, including that longer term document?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Great. That completes the questioning. So I will close discussion on this item. And with no further business to come before the committee, we stand adjourned, and I will turn the floor over to Mr. Smedberg with a request for executive session.
Thank you, Mr. McMillan. In accordance with the bylaws, I, Paul Smedberg, request that the Board of Directors convene an executive session to discuss the following matters pursuant to Article 2, Paragraph 9, subsections A, budgetary matters that may affect legal positions, WMATA contracts, or sensitive relationships with local jurisdictions or the federal government. C, personnel or labor issues, including discussions of labor contracts and labor negotiations, consideration or interviews of candidates for employment, and the assignment, appointment, promotion, performance, demotion, or resignation of individuals. And D, contractual or other matters involving confidential or proprietary concerns, or the investment of public funds where discussion in public would adversely affect the financial interest of WMATA, and safety and security matters where premature release would compromise public safety. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Seconded by Mr. Letourneau. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? The ayes have it. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us today.